Good evening. Call to order the City of Lakewood study session for October 1st, 2018. City Council Chambers. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Hall.
Here.
Johnson.
Here.
Vincent.
Here.
Vita.
Here.
Franks.
Here.
Royball.
Here.
Gutwein. Here. Skilling. Harrison.
Here.
Abel.
Here.
LeBure.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Great. Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. For those in chambers or those checking us out online or on Channel 8, or maybe you'll tune in on a later date. We have a couple of topics tonight of great interest. I see we have a nice contingent who wants to talk about tobacco retailing, and so we're going to have a discussion about that first. And then we have a presentation on the increasingly popular dockless bicycle and scooter sharing. So with that, I'll ask the clerk to read item 3. Nope. So she's getting the same sheet. So I'll just read item 3, discussion non-cigarette tobacco retailers licensing ordinance. And to kick that off, our city attorney, Mr. Cox. Good evening.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and council members. And if you don't mind, we don't have a formal presentation, so I'll stay here and be ready for questions that you might have. We're presenting tonight a draft of the, as the mayor said, the non-cigarette tobacco product retailers licensing ordinance. And just as a refresher, a little bit of background on how this came to be. During the course of 2016 and 2017, various city staff members met with representatives of the Jeffco Health Department and the members of the Breathe Easy team from Lakewood High School. And in May of 2017, that's when the City Council assigned to the then ACIC, the Advisory Commission for an Inclusive Community, with a request to do some research and make some recommendations. As you know, as of a few days from now, the ACIC will become the Lakewood Advisory Commission. So we'll probably refer to that from this point on. In July of this year, the ACIC presented its recommendations to the City Council. And the recommendations were primarily to license retailers who sell non-tobacco cigarette products, so the vape devices, the Juuls that you hear about, the ones that we're talking about, and to include in whatever regulations we adopt, promotion of educational efforts to reduce youth tobacco use. So the ordinance that's in front of you is based largely on the ordinance from the City of Golden. And we happen to have somebody here who has some history with City of Golden. Did you work on this at all? I did. You did? Okay. So we do have a good resource here in the Assistant City Manager, Deputy City Manager. The draft ordinance would require anyone selling the non-cigarette tobacco products to have a city license. You'd have to be 18 years of age or older to purchase. Retailers are required to determine the age of the purchaser in the same way that as we do with other products. The employees of the retail establishment must be 18 years of age or older to handle the products. The licenses are non-transferable, so any new owner would have to apply for a new license. There would be a 500-foot distance requirement from various youth-oriented facilities. Compliance enforcement would be done through both the police department and the city clerk's office. The more of the sting type operations through the police department, but annual inspections anticipated by both departments. Licenses can be suspended or revoked for various transgressions, and the fees for application and licensing would be determined or set forth in a resolution separate from the ordinance. We do have some information put together by the clerk's office and the police department to try to calculate what would be a proposed fee structure based on the expenses required for the inspections. And what we're currently looking at, and it's again not reflected in the draft ordinance, this would be done by resolution, but an application fee of $150 and an annual license fee of $450. That is based on the police chief, Dan McCaskey's estimate of the cost of their inspections plus what the clerk's office would do. We currently estimate 137 retailers would require licensing as it stands today. And other expenses involved would be the hearing officer, city attorney's office time on matters that required it, and a staff person, a secretarial type position in the city clerk's office to manage the licensing program. Finally, just to review what would be the next steps if we were to go forward with this at council's direction. We'd be looking at a first reading ordinance on the 26th of November, with second reading and public hearing scheduled for December 10th. At that same meeting on December 10th would be when the resolution would be presented to set the fee structure. And then if that timetable is adhered to, the ordinance would become effective on January 12th of 2019. In the time leading up to that effective date, there would be a program of notification to the retailers so they'd be fully advised of the new law, and work would go on with the Jeffco Health Department and other agencies and organizations to help educate the public on youth tobacco use as requested by or recommended by the ACIC. So that's a quick overview of the draft ordinance in front of you and the timetable and the plan for going forward.
Thank you. Okay, so we have some public input that we're going to go to here in a minute. And just to re-clarify, so this was brought to the City Council via the community, and then to get a little bit more research, we asked our ACIC to dig into that and make their recommendations. Tonight, we'll hear and be able to ask questions, and that the community will be able to ask questions as well. And we'll hopefully get to a point where we can direct staff to go forward. And if there are any sorts of amendments, get a consensus on what those amendments would look like, and then ask staff to then finalize those amendments to be brought forth to be voted on the dates that you just mentioned. So with that, let's open public comment. 3 minutes. This little box here will be green. For 2.5, it'll go yellow. After that, it'll go red, and we'll ask you to please wrap up your comments. We do allow pooling, and we have a group that has signed up to pool, which will be 10 minutes. And who are my names? Kristen and Jasmine. Okay. And Charmaine, are you all going together? I mean, this is all under the pooling? Okay. So you'll only get 6 minutes. Sorry.
I can handle it.
Yep. Welcome.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to speak with you this evening. My name is Kristen Kidd, and I'm a Lakewood resident. I've lived in Lakewood. It's so hard to have readers and to look out. Anyways, sorry. I've been a resident of Lakewood for over 6 years now. I live in Green Gables. I'm with Ward 5. Rock on, ladies. And I have 2 small children. They're ages 6 and 8. So as I address you today, I'm going to be wearing 2 hats. The first hat is as a public health professional with over 12 years of experience as a tobacco control policy specialist. I'm employed by the Colorado School of Public Health way out at the Anschutz campus, which is a fun commute. And my group has helped pass the very first Colorado tobacco retail license. And my team has most recently partnered with Aspen, Basalt, and Avon on their incredibly strong, comprehensive tobacco retail licenses. I'm also speaking to you today as a member of the Citizens for a Healthier Lakewood, and many of our community members are here with me today. If you guys want to stand up. Awesome, just a few of us. And Tasman is here with us. She's one of our youth members, and she's with Lakewood High School, and she's going to speak when I'm done. So I want to commend the group formerly known as the ACIC and the city staff for all their work on this licensing ordinance. And I'd like to thank the Lakewood City Council for allowing me to speak today. I just want us to remember that tobacco use is still the #1 cause of preventable death in the United States, and the enactment and implementation of these measures can greatly reduce tobacco sales to adolescents during the time in their lives when they are at greatest risk of becoming addicted tobacco users. Copying ordinances already on the books in other communities is a great way to start writing a license. Yet I would caution any community with leaving the language mostly as is. As the industry is always changing and improving their tactics, so too must we be nimble and proactive by promoting the most up-to-date language based on research and practice. The problem of illegal underage tobacco sales has been extensively studied, and there's a newly published article that's out by one of my colleagues. That's Dr. Arnold Levinson out at the School of Public Health. It appeared in JAMA Pediatrics, which is a leading national scientific journal. In their study, they found that, they decided to, rather than check the 201 randomly chosen stores, which happened to be in a Colorado community right outside of Denver with a large number of tobacco retailers, they randomly chose those stores, and they conducted a series of 6 undercover purchase attempts with each store within just a few weeks. And they found that more than half of the 201 randomly chosen stores sold cigarettes to 15 to 16-year-olds at least once, and more than a quarter of them sold to the minors at least twice. So based on these findings, their study recommends each round of testing for compliance should include 2 underage purchase attempts per store rather than just 1, because stores do not behave consistently when adolescents try to buy cigarettes, vaping products, or other tobacco products. So this is going to lead me to my request of you as a citizen and my professional advice. First of all, I encourage you to add language to this ordinance that would prohibit all self-service displays of non-cigarette tobacco products. I encourage you to promote the very best ordinance with the strongest possible language. This includes having a meaningful, active, and therefore impactful enforcement protocol. Steer clear, I would advise, of language such as at the discretion of or as X entity deems appropriate. Rather, describe in the code the number of checks per store required on an annual basis. This will ensure consistency and regularity. Best practice includes checking all retailers at least twice a year with a plan to recheck all violators within 30 to 45 days. I also recommend revising and extending the penalty timeline from 1 year to 3 years. This will allow a hearing officer and enforcement entity to look back at a retailer's track record for more than just 1 year. All of this will require having dedicated staff, like you do with your alcohol program, to oversee regular and consistent enforcement. Finally, best practice recommends having an adequate license fee to ensure education, monitoring, and enforcement costs, that those costs are sufficiently covered and that the program is sustainable. And based on what Mr. Cox says, it sounds like you're really working towards that, and I was really happy with what he's got so far as a proposal. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your consideration and time. As a citizen, I look to my city council to lead the state in being bold, forward-thinking, and impactful. You have the opportunity to draft a very clear, strong ordinance that will serve to protect our young people from a lifetime of tobacco addiction and send a message to retailers that Lakewood both supports business and means business when it comes to protecting the health and safety of its younger citizens. I'm not making these recommendations and walking away with a good luck, Lakewood. I hope it works. My team at the School of Public Health stands ready to offer any assistance in the development of an implementation plan, strategy discussions, legal language, problem solving, and the refinement of any ordinance language, always with a focus on best practice. Further, you have a very strong and able partner with the tobacco control specialists at Jeffco Public Health. They are leaders in the state when it comes to tobacco control, and they're fully capable of providing cutting-edge guidance to help you develop a strong, sustainable, and impactful policy. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tasman. Thank you.
So let me ask this. Somebody, huh? Well, that's what I asked in the beginning. They said there was only 2 people speaking. So are they speaking on behalf of Mary? I have Mary up next. Is Mary here? Okay, they're not speaking on behalf, so you're, okay. So we will continue. Is it just you 2? Okay, go ahead.
Thanks.
Please.
Good evening. My name is Tasman Duncan, and I'm a part of my school's Breathe Easy team. I'm also a member of Citizens for a Healthier Lakewood, and I'm the youth co-chair of the Tobacco Free Jeffco Alliance. I am here speaking once again on the issue of non-cigarette tobacco retail licensing, for the same reason that all of my fellow members over there are here, because we want to see Lakewood become a healthier place. I walk through my hallways of my school every day and I see tombstones, graves waiting to be filled. A group of kids sneaks into the bathroom and vapes. A boy takes a jewel out in class and does this thing called ghosting, where they hold the smoke in their lungs for a longer time just so they aren't seen. Each puff is killing them. There is a silent, scentless, flavored madness that stalks the halls of my school every day. It takes more children each day. In all of them, I see my mother, who is a smoker, and I hear their coughing and hacking, keeping them up at night. I can feel their children's revulsion because it's hard to escape the clouds of secondhand smoke that hang in a room. I see their children standing at their graves because of a stupid, seemingly consequenceless decision in high school, led to a habit that brought them to an early grave. Each one of them is becoming another tally mark in the 480,000 people that tobacco kills each year. The menace that stalks the halls of my school has gone unchecked for a very long time. In that time, vaping among teens has become an epidemic. It's spread to almost half the high school population. And it's only getting worse. I can't honestly stand up here and tell you that this law is going to fix everything and save all of those lives. It won't. There are other sources of tobacco that youth my age can and will get a hold of. What I can tell you is that this law will make a dent and will cut off one of those sources that is easy to exploit. I can tell you that this law has the potential to save lives. A non-cigarette tobacco retail licensing law is a relatively simple and non-intrusive way of combating the menace that is stalking the halls of high schools and middle schools in Lakewood. And so here we are. You've heard many of our CFLHL members and Lakewood youth speak in their support of this ordinance, many of whom are in the audience tonight. You've heard time and time again how we passionately and strongly support a tobacco retail licensing law that is strong enough to keep it out of our high schools. I hope that you keep in mind our stories, support, and passion for protecting youth from the effects of tobacco. I hope that you will put a strong tobacco retail license in place. It's time. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Let the record note there's about 20 plus folks here with your organization in support. Thank you. I'm going to go off track here before Mary. You're going to be up next, and then Diane Duffy. We have a Boy Scout who's joined us, and we always like to welcome our scouts and make you stand up and tell us who you are and what school you go to. Sorry. What's your name, sir?
My name is Patrick.
All right, Patrick, and where do you go to school?
Up in Golden.
Okay. Well, thanks for coming out tonight. Appreciate it. All right, Mary, come on down. Good evening. Welcome.
Good evening. My name is Mary Zarmak, and I'm the Vice President of Governmental Affairs for Smoker Friendly. We're a Colorado family-owned company. We have 2 stores here in Lakewood. We've never had a monetary or no-sale order from the FDA in our 106 stores in the 5 different states that we do business with, over 550 employees. Actually, we have over a 95% compliance rate on checks of legal age sales. I have just a couple of questions for you here, and I realize that you may not answer them, but I'd like you to think about them as you continue to draft this ordinance. I'm concerned about why you're distinguishing a retail tobacco business, and is that not to include C-stores, liquor stores, grocery stores, drug stores that all sell these legal products, including the vape products that were spoken of earlier. All of those types of stores sell them, and they are legal commodities, but I can't imagine why you would want to license one sector of business and not all of the businesses that sell the product. I also have a concern with your description of cigarettes within your definition here, and I think that you should take a hard look at that, because you actually put in other products that are not cigarettes, and you need to look close at that to make sure that you get your fair share of cigarette dollars that come from the state, because I don't think it's correctly written. The suspension and revocation of the license concerns us very much, and I did bring the FDA's, how they do their civil money penalty and or revocation of opportunity to sell tobacco products. First of all, for your first violation, it's just a warning letter. Second violation within a 12-month period is $279. Third violation within a 24-month period is $559. Fourth, within a 24-month period is $2,236. Fifth violation within 36-month period is $5,591. Sixth, within a 48-month period is $11,000. And after that, you actually lose your license to sell tobacco. So I guess I would just say, as a retailer, and I feel like we're a very responsible retailer, we certainly have no intention of selling to children at any level. We sell adult commodities in our stores, and we are very much age-restricted stores. I think that the revocation and suspension of opportunity to sell tobacco is very harsh. I also find it interesting that the city of Lakewood opposed a state licensing bill earlier this year that would have been very comprehensive, it was brought to the state legislators, and it was well funded for over 4,000 stings a year. But your city was one that did not agree with that. And then last, I would just say that
Your time's
in none
up.
of these,
Your time's up.
okay, none of these you have no consequences for underage use or using the product. And I think that you need to look as a city that the children that are using the products need to be under scrutiny. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Duffy, come on down. Good evening.
Good evening, Mayor. Good evening, Council. As you all well know, I worked on the project on the Lakewood Advisory Commission for the non-tobacco licensing. And I'm glad they were very clear in writing this ordinance to not include cigarettes. That was very much our intent when we provided that to you, that recommendation. Just a couple things I did want to bring out. We did intend to have in the ordinance that the items need to be behind the counter. Currently, cigarettes have to be behind the counter. There's absolutely no self-service. And I think we mistakenly assumed that that would be part of this ordinance. We fully intended for these items to be not self-service, where children could get at them. I just wanted to make that clear. We fully intended on that to be included, and it should be. The other thing was, I noticed the 500 feet that you put in the ordinance. That made me stop and pause because I reflected back to the liquor ordinance that we worked on a year and a half, 2 years ago. And what we were finding with the neighborhoods like Belmar, where you could have a charter school and a convenience store within 500 feet. So that's something you're going to have to take a look at. And I'm not saying it's good or bad, but remember we looked at that and said that, you know, you can't look at those distances anymore as realistic since we're going to those neighborhoods like Belmar, where you're going to have everything in walking distance. So you're going to have a King Soopers that sells non-tobacco, and you're going to have a charter school right next door. The other thing I wanted to mention was we did a lot of discussion about the enforcement, and we realized that the Lakewood Police Department is stretched pretty thin. And we talked a lot about you're using code enforcement or the liquor enforcement, and maybe beefing up those areas, and they could do some of these checks. They're not going out and making arrests. They're going out and and doing a check and then coming back to provide a report. So we wanted to, we talked about that a lot, and I'm sorry if we didn't make that clear in our recommendation, that is something you should maybe look at. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, anybody else? All right, we'll close public comment. Thank you very much, and we'll go to council questions and comments as well. I'm just gonna start with one right off the bat. There was a mention. I'll start with two. One, if we need more clarity on the definition of a cigarette, I'd ask that you please email us and submit where we might be lacking. And then the other part, we've had this conversation off and on, I think, for many years, and especially with our SROs at the high schools, as to there isn't really a function to penalize underage users, but I think council's shied away from finding criminal penalties for kids utilizing tobacco. I think part of it had to do with getting kids into the justice system earlier for something that is an addicting substance. So there's been some compassion and some concern, and that's something that I certainly wouldn't want to engage in, is criminalizing the usage at this point. I think there's other opportunities. I think Golden has a cessation program for youth that are caught smoking, and that could be something that's beyond, but I think that would apply to all use of tobacco. All right, I'm going to go to Mr. Abel and Mr. Skilling.
There was a question about frequent inspections by police. How many retailers do we expect would be licensed under this program?
The number our research revealed was 137. Is that right, Margie? Yeah. The ACIC did that. They came up with that number as part of their research.
Okay. There would be an exemption for existing retailers that are within 500 feet of schools. Would that exemption be passed along to the next purchaser of the property?
We haven't talked about that. The license is not transferable, so.
No, but
Yeah, my thought was with a non-transferable license that it would be a new application.
a new application, but does the exemption continue?
Right.
Since it's so close to a school, or would that person would the grandfathering die when the property changes hands?
I don't think the draft addresses that question, so it would be council's direction as to which way you'd want it to go, I believe.
There were some questions about behind-the-counter sales. I think we should add that.
We have language to that effect. It did not make it into this draft, but we did have that request, and it can easily be added.
Are there other things that you contemplate would be added? Maybe that would help.
At this point, the ones mentioned by one of the speakers tonight, we received some of those via email, and that was regarding the possibility of additional inspections. Now we have some information from the police chief about available resources, and so we'd have to talk about where to put the emphasis on additional inspections, or give the police department a little more opportunity to get up to speed on that.
That's the reason I asked about how many retailers could you share with. I hate to interrupt a question that you're already answering, but what did the chief say about resources?
What he determined was that at the current time, personnel resources are pretty limited in the police department, as has been acknowledged. And he does not think that the inspection program could be undertaken with current staffing, but his recommendation or his proposal was that police staff in an overtime capacity be used for that function, funded by the license fees as they would be, as we're attempting to calculate them. And that's based on the idea of one compliance check per year by the police department.
And I'm sorry, you were telling us what else we were thinking about adding.
I think you heard about them. The request or suggestion was to have twice a year compliance checks and to increase the violation review window from 1 year to 3 years, so you can look back farther for any previous violations. Adequate license fees. Those are the things that we had heard about previously and that we heard about also tonight. And that included the self-service display. So I think we've covered the suggested additions.
There was a suggestion or a concern about revocation or suspension. What do we base that on? The
Based-
provisions for revocation or suspension.
I believe the language that we used, again, was borrowed from Golden's ordinance, absent any different direction from the council to be stricter or less strict. So that's open to discussion.
I'll take it there's not a lot of precedent out there from some of the comments. There aren't a lot of these ordinances.
There's only a handful of them in the state, so.
Okay. I think you've done a good job of looking at the entire picture. And when I started smoking, I'm just recalled with Commissioner or Councilwoman Harrison, it was grapevine. Was the first thing I smoked. And there were no cautions about health to speak of, and I think anything we can do to prevent folks from making the mistake I made and carried on for 40 years would be a good thing. Thank you.
Said. Mr. Skilling, then Ms. Harrison, then Ms. Gutwein, Mr. Royball, then Ms. Johnson.
So piggybacking on what Mr. Abel just discussed, the police officers, we have CSOs that could maybe fill this function a lot cheaper than a police officer. Maybe.
There are options potentially available. I don't know that the chief addressed them in the comments that he provided us, but those estimates were based on the current agent staffing levels, but there are other potential divisions that could be used.
Yeah, because just a thought, we don't need sworn officers. We could use the community service or what I guess they're community resource officers. But that was just a thought. I have a couple quick comments to respond to the public comment that we heard. When I was reading this ordinance, I didn't really distinguish this between tobacco shops and the King Soopers. I maybe misguidedly presumed that this did. I understand there's some distinctions within the definitions, but as you read the actual ordinance itself, it's fairly clear that it's any person, and I'll get to that, that sells this would be subject to this. That would seem to include a liquor store, a gas station, a Walmart, a Kmart, or whatever kind of mart you want. Am I missing a definition or an exclusion somewhere?
No, if the intent is what you've indicated.
To be inclusive of all of those sellers.
Right, based on there's a percentage reference in the definition that would be come into play.
Well, the percentage reference, that's the 25%.
Yes.
But that definition doesn't carry through the entire ordinance, I note. And in fact, the definition, I think, would go against including all of it reads in somewhat of a strange way that it's, and that's no offense to anybody,
Right.
as always,
Understood.
but it reads in an odd way that it's other products is less than 25% of the gross sales, which seem to indicate if 75% of what you sell is tobacco-related products, then you're covered by this, at least this definition. But this definition doesn't carry throughout the ordinance.
That may be the case, but our intention is however you want to define it, if you want to include all those businesses, we can tighten up the definition and the language to make sure that it is consistent throughout.
Yeah, I would strike the 25%. I don't know what the relevance of having 25%. Either you sell it, whether you have a small little something behind the counter or you got a whole counter, whatever it is, it should be covered. And then there's in 5.06.050, it says rebuttal. I think the word should actually be rebuttable presumption instead of rebuttal. So that's a cleanup there. So that will be rebuttable presumption. Then on 090, it's non-transferable. And I'll link that with, on 030, the definition of person. So a lot of this seems to be, for whatever reason, geared at individuals and people. And I think that we're going to have far more instances of companies and businesses than we are people. So when we're talking about the business itself, we should probably phrase it as companies.
I think what we need, as you know, Counselor, in both meanings of the word, person is often defined to include an entity, and we probably need a definition of person to make that clear.
Sure, and it comes to that transferable part because we talk about spouses and partnerships and all of that. What's interesting about we may want to look at the transferability, if I can use that word, transferability of this. If somebody buys a business, maybe we should think about somehow including this, wrapping about, maybe it's not a separate license. I don't know how that's going to work. I don't know if we're doing background checks on people. I don't know how that's going to work. But if I buy a business, I'm usually buying all the bulk assets with it. That would include the licenses that come with it. If we want to do, I know for liquor licenses, you sometimes have to do the full background check for various reasons. So if we're going to go that far, then you'd have to define, okay, well, if a company's buying it, who in the company is going through the background check? So that's why I was linking person with transferability. That, I think, needs to be flushed out more about who's getting the license and then making it a little bit easier to transfer. And then to raise more money and to, in fact, maybe educate the new owners or what have you. Maybe you want a transfer fee or something like that to add to it. That's all I had.
Ms. Greer, did you want to add to that? It's kind of your area.
Just listening to Counselor Skilling, I'm thinking that perhaps it's best to have it non-transferable or not being able to transport it from one location to another. But I agree, we could add a transfer location from one owner to the next at one location. I mean, it seems to me if somebody buys a 7-Eleven store, they ought to be able to sell the same products that were there when they bought it. So I think we can add that in here pretty easily.
Great. Thank you. Ms. Harrison.
I would echo much of what Councillor Skilling talked about, and specifically I would want to see this touch all retailers in the city of Lakewood doing business that offer these products to anybody. So I think it needs to be all retailers. Thank you.
Ms. Gutwein.
Thank you. First, just really want to thank everyone who has spent so many hours on this in the community, and then also the group formerly known as the ACIC, and of course staff for the tremendous work that you have done on this. Thank you. I'm really excited that we're at this stage. And then most of what I have to say has already been brought up, and I just want to echo that I think it is really important that we prohibit all of the self-service displays, as was mentioned before. It sounds like that amendment will already be brought forward at the next meeting. The second issue, and this has been one of the biggest concerns, I think, from council and also from the ACIC, is whether the police department would be responsible for all checks. And it says in the ordinance that that the city clerk's office and the police department would be responsible for overseeing this. Does that mean that, and I'm not sure whether to direct this to you, Margie, or to Tim, so would your office be responsible for that as well? How are you figuring that you're going to share these responsibilities?
It's similar to what we do with liquor right now, where we license the liquor establishments, and we also have a non-sworn person in my office that actually goes into the liquor locations and makes sure that their license is posted, that in this case they would make sure that the products are not being in a self-service display, that they're behind the counter, whatever other rules you want. The police department would be the one doing the compliance checks or those sting operations.
Okay, great. So then is the fee that we're discussing, does that cover both the compliance check from your office and the compliance check from the police department? So two in 1 year?
It's all inclusive.
Okay, great. So in that case, then, I think that when we talk about whether or not to do a biannual or an annual check, if we can do two, one from the clerk's office, one from the police department, and then I really think it's important that we add the amendment that violators are rechecked within 45 days. That was in the amendments that were sent to you. The reason why, of course, is if it's a full year before they get checked again, it would be hard, well, for one thing, they could continue selling to minors, and then you probably would never reach this second offense within a 1 year period if you're not even checked again by that point. So I support doing a recheck for violators within 45 days. And then finally, this was also discussed, but the section 5.06.120 on the second page, section E, it has some kind of discretionary language that we've been talking a lot about during our campaign finance meetings as well, that we really want to make sure things are clear and have less discretion so that there's not an unfair implementation of the rules or perceived unfair implementation. And so I think any way that we can tighten this up and remove discretion, potentially even removing that whole section E and just saying if there's a first offense, you're suspended for 7 days, a second offense, suspended for 30, and so on. So tighten up and or remove section E. And then finally, I also agree that expanding number 3 for a third or subsequent offense within a 3-year window instead of a 1-year window. And then one procedural question: do we need to get consensus on all the amendments tonight?
Yes. We'll need the consensus, and you'll have to all help me tighten up the some of the language that we've thrown out there too.
Great.
So you're all set to go.
Thank you.
Yep. So we can come back. So we'll keep going through this first round, and then we can come back to potential questions. Mr. Roybal, Ms. Johnson, Ms. Franks. And
Thank
Ms.
you, Mayor. I'd like to kind of go back to the penalty phase. Can you talk a little bit about, for example, if this vendor got caught once, what would happen? Got caught twice, what would happen? And if they revoke their license, what is the policy, or what would be the policy? For example, it would be a hearing officer that you go forward and plead your case and go through. It's like a mini court. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that?
Certainly, and this is the area that Councilor Gutwein was just addressing as well, the enforcement provisions or the suspension revocation language. It's set up so that, there would be a determination that there was a violation. It would be presented to a hearing officer. Section E, which Councilor Gutwein mentioned, has the factors that the hearing officer would consider in deciding what sanctions, whether to impose sanctions or not. And then you see at the bottom of that last page, just above the word enforcement, are the first, second, third, and subsequent offenses. So the first offense, as currently written, and this is all open to council discussion. But for the first offense, suspension would be 7 days. The second offense, suspension for 30 days if it's in the same 1 year period. And for a third or subsequent offense within a 1 year period, the license would be revoked.
Now, is there a fine attached to that, a minimum standard fine, or is that just
No, there's no fine structure in this. If it were to go to municipal court, there would be fines available as penalties, but as set up in this administrative process, it would be strictly the suspension.
The suspension itself. Okay. So if any violations, like for example, if they put let's say, for example, they had the display out where the kids can reach it, but the ordinance says we want it behind the counter, and they violated that, that would be one violation.
Well, assuming that the hearing officer saw it that way, remember that as currently written, there are a number of factors that are considered, the nature and circumstances of the violation. So some violations are going to be more egregious than others. Whether it was a willful violation or something that happened accidentally, an employee put it in the wrong place without knowing that that was the law, something like that. There are circumstances that would mitigate against the penalties. And I should add that we do have the cumulative language in the enforcement section that says if there are other penalties and remedies available at law, they're available to us. They're not incorporated in this ordinance, but if there is an opportunity to use other remedies, we haven't forfeited that right to do that.
Now, another thing that just popped up in my brain here, signs. Or some kind of a signage being posted that here's the game rules to the young kids, saying that we're not going to sell you any product, and this, you got to be at the age of 18 or older before you can get this product. But anything below 18, don't ask. We card ID or we ask for ID that you're of age. Can we do something like that?
There's already a federal law out there that requires that. So anyone who is selling it now already has that sign.
Okay.
They can't be under the age of 18.
So would we, how would I say, would we ask to repeat that and make it part of the ordinance that it's a must, or remind them that this is the rules or laws, or do they already know?
They already know. I don't think we need to duplicate it in our ordinance.
Okay.
Certainly something we can have our inspector go out when she makes her rounds and check for that, just to make sure, but I don't think it belongs in a local ordinance.
Okay. That's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Johnson?
Thank you. Just a couple thoughts. First, I absolutely hate cigarette smoke. I want that to be real clear. But I don't hate cigarette smokers. I grew up in one of those homes where my dad learned how to smoke in World War II. My stepmother was a chain smoker and took off her oxygen so she could smoke. It's a horrible habit, and it took me years, frankly, to get it out of the walls and carpet of their home. It's a sad commentary when you've got an industry that has grown up creating these jewels and things, basically, that do harm to others. That doesn't speak much for us as a society. And I believe that the jewels not only can contain nicotine, but other pretty egregious compounds. Is that right?
I know that's true of the various vaping devices. I assume it's true of the jewels as well.
Okay. I absolutely agree. In some of this literature, it points to the bottom line is the parental education, and we're the parents, and they need to be listed first. There was one document that I read today from the Wall Street Journal, and it was talking about the public health department and then police, and then it listed parents. And I thought, we've got this backwards. The parents need to be listed first. We can't be usurping their ability here. In fairness, I think I'm for this ordinance, and I want to get that off the table. We need to do something. But I also think that we need to look at our businesses and have something that's balanced, that we understand that we are dealing with small businesses as well, and put something that's fair on both sides of that. I do have trouble regulating substances for adult behavior. This, I believe, is targeting only the youth. Now, there's a couple things in this ordinance, though, that I'd like to address. The license cannot be given to somebody under 18, right?
Correct.
No license can be issued, right, to someone under 18.
Now, the person that sells it, they have to be 18 or older, correct?
To handle the product, you have to be 18 or older, so.
Okay. Okay, in the ordinance itself, it talks about a hearing officer, and I don't think we need to get into this tonight, but I think we do need to understand what the criteria is for that person, how that person's going to be selected, and that person has a great deal of authority, actually, and just to make sure that we've got some guidelines in place on how that's done. Let's see here, it's page 6 in this ordinance, 06-100, it talks about the fee for the license and that it's established from time to time. I think that is way too vague. That could be every 3 months, that could be every 3 years. That somehow, we don't need to do that tonight, but we need to have a more definitive time when that fee for the license is going to be established. On page 7, under compliance and monitoring, it talks about additional compliance checks shall be conducted as the department deems appropriate. That's too vague. We need to have specific guidelines. Just saying when it's appropriate really is inadequate, in my opinion. And this next one, this kind of threw me. We're talking about on page 7, 06.110 about youth decoys. Is that also in the liquor ordinance where there are youth decoys? Is that language used?
I don't remember if it is there or not, but most of the time the police department use their Eagle Scouts to help with the liquor compliance checks.
Okay, I understand that. Mm-hmm. However, when you have this language in an ordinance, I guess you'll have to talk to me what the difference between that and entrapment is. I'm just a little uncomfortable with seeing that codified like this. Can you please talk about that? Entrapment. I don't want to see us get to a point where this sounds punitive either.
I know, as Margie said, the process is used routinely in the liquor context, and this would be the same thing. I confess I've not done research on the issue of entrapment. I'm sure it's been alleged in cases where this kind of activity happens, and I would bet that the law in Colorado recognizes that this is a legitimate way of enforcing and has distinguished it from entrapment. We just have to do a little more research to look at that.
Okay. And then this is being put in place basically to diminish consumption. Is there actual data that having this kind of licensing diminishes consumption of the youth? Do we know that as a fact?
The Jeffco Health Department has provided some of that information to ACIC, and I can get it for you again.
Okay, that would be good. Let's see. This would also be in addition to the surveyors, if you will, with the CDPHE, or They complement each other as far as compliance checks? Doesn't the CDPHE also weigh in on this kind of enforcement with tobacco products? Maybe I'm mistaken.
No,
You're
I-
looking at me like I'm
Not-
goofy.
not to my
Perhaps I'm
knowledge. I
wrong.
don't know, though.
I'm just not aware of that. Neither is Margie. Whether they do the same kinds of inspections.
Okay, because I thought that I had seen where they do 2,500 a year, but I don't know how many surveyors they have, and I don't know what they do as far as compliance either. I was just wondering if they if we would complement that, or okay,
We'll find out.
okay. I guess that's all for now. Thank you.
Ms. Franks, and then Ms. Vincent.
Thanks, Mayor Paul. Since I know you'll be getting to kind of going down through the list, I am definitely in support of banning the self-service displays, removing any minimums percentage. If you sell the product, you sell the product. Certainly cleaning up and removing any of the discretionary language to the degree we can to ensure a common enforcement. One piece I wanted to dig in on was the Chief McCaskey's kind of assessment of resource impact. Are we then talking about that the police department would act in a coordinator role and then leverage Eagle Scouts and other teen volunteers? Is that what we're talking about? We're not talking about where we have, we're contracting out. Are we looking at having volunteers be the actual ones who attempt to make the purchases?
I think that's the intent. Yeah, exactly. Is to have the as they're referred to as the youth decoys.
Absolutely. And so the police department, they would be basically in a program coordination role in monitoring that and providing the training. And so all of those aspects. So is the overhead we're trying to finance with the fees?
Yeah, there's a reference in Chief McCaskey's notes about enforcement requiring 2 police agents and 1 juvenile. So that would be, I guess, the standard practice.
Anytime they go out with juveniles, they like to have 2 agents. Just to ensure that there's no impropriety or anything like that, assumption of impropriety. So anytime the youth is out in the community, there would be 2 police agents with that youth.
Oh, okay. That helps me understand where the costs come in, just because I'm not familiar with those programs. And also, I do support conducting more than 1 compliance check per year. Twice per year seems to be something that's agreed upon as a best practice. Certainly the window of review, kind of the look back period. But I also wanted to bring up a point of, are we looking, because I didn't have a chance to read everything as thoroughly as I might have liked, like if we have a violator, that they would then fund their own reinspection fee? Because what you don't want to happen is to try to bake in the fee to accommodate everybody pays the same high fee, but you have good actors who, never get caught, and they would maybe pay 1 fee, but if they would pay for their own way if they get caught. Or have we looked at that? Is that in there, or did I overlook that?
I don't think it's in there. I think it's a good idea to pass the cost along in the form of a fee for anyone who has to be reinspected. Yeah.
Right. That way we can get that loop going where we get those consistent re-inspections at a good periodic rate to demonstrate that we're moving in the right direction, but we don't have to bake into the overall cost, the cost of those folks for that. I know that is a little bit hard from a standpoint of funding things because it becomes a variable income stream versus a fixed one, but I wouldn't like to penalize all the retailers trying to accommodate that. So that would be what I would want to say there. And how are we determining on the adequately cover the full cost of implementing? Is it literally just a head count? It's not any other administrative paperwork. It's literally how many agents are needed to deploy and how many staff Margie needs, what part of a staff member she needs to do those. So it's literally just head count.
Well, I'll let Margie address what the perspective from her office. Chief McCaskey's notes do break it down into a number of elements.
Okay.
With the estimated 137 retail establishments currently, with each to take about half an hour to complete each check. That means about 70 hours to check compliance 1 time per year per establishment. So if you just do the one police department check in a year, he estimates about 70 hours, and there's a cost for the 2 agents that he estimates here. the cost of paying a minimum wage to a minor to be part of that process. Some startup costs to get the program running, about $10,000 he estimates per year in initial costs. And then some unknowns, some categories of expenses that he's not able to estimate at this time.
Sure, no, I
There's an
appreciate
attempt
that.
to break it down, though.
And I definitely like that we have those numbers, because I'm more comfortable with the best practice of 2 per year, and then finding a mechanism for the offenders to be penalized to pay for their own reinspection fees. And that's all I have.
Thank you. As we continue to go down, if you have one of these motions sheets, or if you need one, start thinking about what you're gonna want to propose, so we can start to narrow that down as well, please. Ms. Vincent.
I agree with everything that's been said. I do have a couple of things. I'd like to see E cleaned up somehow, because there is a lot of ambiguity in here. But I would like something where a hearing officer does have some flexibility in making the determination. They're going to be the ones hearing the case. And one of the things that came to my mind was, I know we had someone up here at one time that was speaking about the fact that if they catch anyone who sells a product to a minor, they're immediately fired. So that's something that business is doing. So that's my consideration for that. The other one is Councilor Abel brought it up about the 500 feet, and then Ms. Duffy talked about that things are changing now, and we have charter schools right next to, with the walkability thing. Is there something, have you looked at that? Is there something we can do about that? Is it 500 feet no matter what?
No, we actually took that provision from Golden, and so if it's something that you want deleted, that's fine.
Well, I would like to see some requirement for certainly new ones that come on, but
Well, the existing ones would be grandfathered in.
grandfathered in, wouldn't
Be
they?
an issue.
Did you have an issue with that in Golden, with the smaller communities coming in?
We didn't, but there are certainly some communities that have had issues with that.
Thoughts?
Remember that the concept is really borrowed from the liquor licensing scheme under state law. That's where the 500-foot rule is applied to all different categories of liquor businesses. And then by state statute, the local governments are given the ability to decide whether to change that number, eliminate it for one category of license but not for another. I think the intent here was probably Golden's intent as well, to keep it pretty simple and just have a set measurement from those schools to any kind of retail establishment that has to get a license. So, the state law for liquor gives you lots of avenues for addressing the realities of your the landscape, like the Belmar example. Under this rule, if we wanted to do that, it would take some creative work to come up with some other alternatives. But I think the idea was just, let's create a buffer between schools and these retailers and keep it simple, I guess.
Because we did just have issues with liquor license near schools a couple months ago, so.
Yeah. And exercise the city's option to change the rules, change the limit for one category of license, I think it was.
Okay.
But here, all the licenses are the same.
Yeah. I don't know how to address it, but, so I guess we could leave it as a rule and just go from there. Let's see, okay.
All right, Mr. Beta.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, let me just say that I certainly support this effort here. I think it's got the right idea, and it's important that we go forward. So, my appreciation on the work that's been done. Also, I want to just comment with something Councilor Johnson said, and that is, it's really important for us to remember that there's always a balancing act here, because we do want to make sure that we're treating our retailers, our businesses, and our community fair. And I know you're trying to do that, but I think as we go through that, we want to make sure that we've done that in all respects, not have too much discretion, make sure they're all being treated equally. Now, having said that, one thing I find kind of interesting here is the penalties. And I will tell you that I've, as an attorney, it's over 40 years, I've had my fair share of liquor hearings for clients involved in liquor violations, and I've got a pretty good idea not only how it works, but what happens if you're sell to minors, and it's not pretty. And it, the thing is, when you're talking about a violation of a establishment selling liquor to a minor, and they suspend their license, typically they do, and that the schedule you have here, 7 days, 30 days, is somewhat in the range. But keep in mind, when you suspend a liquor license, they're out of business. Okay, they're out of business for 7 days or 30 days. They're closed down. There's no revenue. There's no nothing. And I'm not sure that's the case here. You know, they're not selling the product, this particular product, under their license, but they're still in business. And so I think what I'm saying is, I think this is actually, in my opinion, fairly generous enforcement penalties. And I noticed that you said something about penalties, and I didn't quite understand your comments about fines, because there's nothing in here about fines. And I will tell you, typically in the liquor industry, there's fines on top of the suspension period. And so I'm kind of wondering why we don't have that.
Again, the clerk wants to address that. Sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to address that if you don't mind. In the liquor hearings, they're allowed to pay a fine in lieu of closing down their liquor sales. So that's the big difference, and most of the liquor establishments do that. They pay a fine, which allows them to keep selling. Very few times do we go in and actually stop the sale for 7 days or 5 to 10 days, whatever the penalty may be.
But isn't that fine usually calculated based upon their sales during a certain period? So if it's a 7-day suspension, there's a fine that's calculated roughly equivalent to that, to what it would,
Correct.
their loss of revenue during that period?
Correct.
Okay, yeah.
But the 30 days that we have in here is, compared to liquor, is pretty steep, actually. Liquor 1, 2, and 3 violations are like 5 to 10 days, 10 to 15. Very seldom do we ever go any beyond that without suspending or revoking their license.
But they're still in business, they're just not able to sell this particular product.
Correct. Correct.
Whereas in liquor, they're out of business for that period.
Well,
unless
if
they
it's a
pay the
full
fine.
retail or store, it would be, but if it's a 7-Eleven, then they just quit selling the beer, the fermented malt beverage, but their store is still open for business.
Right, I'm speaking more of like a bar.
The retail and yeah.
Right, but even the restaurants can function without a liquor license for a period of time if they have
They
to.
still can sell food, right?
That's all I have.
All right, so I have a question. I also have a couple comments. I want to encourage, and the balance is very important. I think going back to when we did our medical marijuana ordinances, we worked hard with the industry to make sure we found a balance. So while we're up here discussing this, I encourage, we had folks who came tonight and the previous time and said, hey, we're okay with some of this. Still going to be important that we hear from you and talk to us about different things. One area that I did have a question about, and that goes back to our smoking in public places. So it's 9.38.040. I would think that there would need to be an exception under number 4 to any retail tobacco business, provided that no person under 18 years of age shall be allowed on the premises. So like our cigar bars or even a couple smoker friendlies, potentially, I don't know if you have one in Lakewood where smoking is allowed, they would be exempted, or what I would perceive would be exempted from this because you have to be 18 to even enter the premises. So I don't know if that is the way you would see that, or if that'd be something that would need to be proposed. It's already in our ordinance. You have to be 18 to enter those facilities. So there would be no minors entering.
Well, theoretically, I guess that's the problem, is people aren't necessarily going to follow the rules. And if you're 18 and you're buying a product from a retail store, you're under 18, or you're under 18 and you enter one of those establishments hoping to purchase or whatever, there's got to be the ability to prevent that sale from happening, because it still could happen the same way it does in another retail store.
But I believe on the door it's noted that nobody under 18 is allowed, whereas at King Soopers or a grocery store or 7-Eleven, it's the general public. You understand that? I mean, there's a distinguishable difference.
I do. I think to consider it an exemption doesn't prevent those illegal sales from happening, because someone under 18 comes in to the store, is not asked for ID, and is able to make a purchase. That's the same kind of violation you're going to get in the convenience store setting. Or it's just whether they get in or not, and I don't know how that's policed by the establishments.
Okay. Then it would seem that it would be useless to have that rule in effect anyways, if you went with that philosophy, right? I mean, there is some sort of self-policing involved in the fact that it is a violation. So just like if we were doing a potential sting operation on purchasing a vape at a 7-Eleven, it'd be the same type of thing if we're trying to enter a tobacco store that prohibits 18 and under, or a bar after a certain period of time that prevents 21 and under.
Well, and I think that's a great example, because you can have a bar setting with that rule in place, and yet minors can be present if no one's paying attention, and they can be served if the proper attention is not being given. So I think it's similar in that respect. You have a presumption that no one's going to enter who's underage, but it's not necessarily the reality.
So, but the reality also is there's probably less than 10 that exist in the city that would be under that rule and regulation. Would that be an accurate observation? Okay. That might be something we need to check. I mean, I can think of 3 off the top of my head.
I think we heard that there are 2 smoker-friendly stores in the city.
But I don't think both allow smoking, and I'm kind of looking. But Tobacco Leaf is certainly one. Cleopatra's, but that's a bar restaurant. So I remember from our conversation, it's very, very few, but they were grandfathered in, and then the rule was put in place that you had to be 18 to enter, period. So that's something that I can potentially propose, I guess. Ms. Johnson and Mr. Abel.
I forgot to ask, the fee, please talk, it's not subject to Tabor, or is it?
No. Generally speaking, fees and taxes are distinguishable, and the fee that's intended to cover the actual cost of providing the service would be considered a fee.
Okay.
And not subject to Tabor.
And also, do we have any idea what kind of, how much of these products are being purchased over the internet?
I don't know.
Or can they be? I don't even know.
Everything can.
Pretty much anything can.
Not limited.
I don't know if the ACIC looked at that as part of their research. We have not.
No. Diane's waving no. Okay. I'm just wondering how that would have, this kind of thing would affect that kind of sale. I don't know. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Abel.
I'd like to expand on what the city attorney said about comparing those lounges, smoking lounges, to bars. When I was a kid, if I could get in a bar at 18, I'd go in there and buy my beer, and if they didn't think they'd get caught, they'd sell it. So I think that whatever licensing or prohibitions we put here should apply to any establishment that sells tobacco and non-cigarette tobacco items.
Thank you. Okay. Amendments. So we're probably going to have some redundancy. So if I read one out and you're like, oh yeah, mine had that as well, help me. Add definition of person to broadly include entities, companies, etc. I think that was on a couple people's list. Is that consensus? Okay. Any questions about that, Mr. Cox?
No, I think we have our marching orders there.
Make clear that the ordinance includes all sellers. Is there consensus on that? Clear on that, Mr. Cox?
Yes.
Okay. Transfers to new owners subject to transfer fee. Looking around here. Okay, I have consensus there. Is that clear?
Yes, we talked about a transfer fee to a new owner at the same location.
And I'll keep these handy so you can refer. Okay. Behind the counter, I think that's something that we heard echoed, no self-service. So consensus on that. Okay, ban self-service, we did that. Remove mention of percent of sales and have ordinance apply to all retailers, but this removes the actual percentage. Okay, thank you. So we'll just do that. Conduct 2 compliance checks per year and recheck violators within 30 to 45 days.
Clerk would like to be heard on that.
May I speak to that?
Yes, please. Please.
You know, we've been doing a lot of comparison tonight with the liquor laws. And currently, the police department does not do 1 compliance check a year on all of the liquor establishments. In fact, in the last 2 to 3 years, the Special Investigations Unit has done a few in conjunction with the state, but very few on their own. So I think that you're taking a very highly regulated industry, such as the tobacco industry, such as liquor, and then you're applying more constrictive. I'm just mentioning that, just so you know that we heard tonight, do it like liquor. Well, liquor doesn't do it this way.
Ms. Vincent, go ahead.
And my question about that too is my first thought is what kind of burden does that place on our folks within 45 days? And then do we potentially have retailers going, just cool your jets for 45 days and then they won't bug us for a year? That's been done.
Ms. Gutwein?
I do support moving to the 2 checks a year. I also, though, think that we should, I don't know did you have a chance to explore the other options of compliance checks that were mentioned? I think it was from other cities or other states that didn't use the police department, but still did compliance checks using the youth decoys. And perhaps if not, then maybe we can explore those so that we're not putting unnecessary burden on the police department between now and our next meeting.
I know in conversations with the police chief that if they're going to do them, they would rather do it themselves than depend on someone else just because of the liability involved. They want to make sure they're the ones training the youth, etc.
Okay.
And does it have to be 2 compliance checks, or could it be 1 compliance check from the police department and 1 liquor inspection from my department?
So I think that
that's what we're proposing, but
the best practice is 2 youth decoy checks and the initial check with your office to make sure that the education is understood and the laws are understood. So, but of course, you know, everything costs money and we have only so many hours, and police hours. So I think that perhaps we should just continue to get more information and see if it is feasible for us to do 2 compliance checks a year, if we would need to increase the rate. And if so, then I think a second option could be 1 compliance check from the police department and the follow-up 45 days. And I certainly recognize what you're saying, that maybe people would just follow it for the 45 days after, but that's better than if you get a violation and then there's no follow-up. So,
But there had to be one within a year.
yeah.
Yep, Ms. Franks, Mr. Beta, then Ms. Harrison.
So maybe we can offer, the whole point is we're trying to take a problem that's become epidemic and we're trying to make a meaningful impact. What if we were to look at that we had the one, and I agree with having the license, kind of the license check and the youth check, but maybe we say in the first year there'll be a random second check for 25% of the businesses, and then we can have some data to start to show whether those second checks do what we think they're going to do. So maybe, would you guys be amenable to, the whole point is, I mean, I come from a family where I was the only non-smoker, so I know all about secondhand smoke. I had everyone in the family smoking except for me, which is sometimes 8 cigarettes going at one time. So I just want to make sure that we find a way to ferret out the folks who are doing a good job, and also find some data points that we can say, are we, with 2 checks, more likely to push the sales to minors down lower? So would we kind of maybe want to, with a 25% of the population gets a second check without putting too much burden? Is that a good compromise?
Yep, so one second. I have 3 more lights on. So Mr. Beta, Ms. Harrison, and then Ms. Vincent.
Thank you, Mayor. Well, again, kind of comparing this to the what goes on in the liquor, I think this is real similar. You know, the police officers the police department's pretty good at ferreting this out. And I'll tell you, as an example, if they get word from the street that there's some illegal sales going on, that's where they go with their sting. Okay, that's kind of the first step. So they've always got their ear to the ground, and they know where something's not being, where the compliance already is. So the sting is the follow-up. And I don't know why there would be any reason to not follow that same protocol here. The other thing to keep in mind is that just the fact that the sting can occur at any time randomly throughout the city will keep a retailer on their toes. I mean, they know that any time it could walk in, anytime, anywhere. A lot of times if there is a violation, there will automatically be a follow-up in 30 to 45 days. The retailers almost know there's going to be a second follow-up. So those kind of protocols work real well from what my experience in the industry. So I guess what I'm saying, maybe we ought to take a lead more from our police department and trust them to tell us what we need in here, as opposed to trying to set a rigid, 2 times a year. I understand what you're saying, and I think our police department can guide us on this pretty well.
So would that be sticking with the proposed language then, would be your recommendation? The actual stuff, what's being proposed, hard copy tonight? Yep, we'll come back. Mr. Cox.
Provide that language. There's been a lot of talk about discretion, and I will agree there might be places in the ordinance where we can look at whether discretion is appropriate. But one place where it's used is with regard to compliance monitoring, and that's where it says there shall be an annual compliance check by the clerk and the police department. And then additional compliance checks shall be conducted as the department deems appropriate to determine at a minimum if the non-cigarette tobacco product retailer is conducting business in a manner that complies with the laws, et cetera. I think that's what Councilor Bede is talking about, is when they sense there's a problem somewhere, the police are going to follow up on that. They're going to do the additional checks that they think are necessary. So I think this provides for an automatic annual of every business, and then where there are places where there's apparent or possible trouble, that's where they'll focus their energies rather than requiring a mandatory second check of every business. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess unless our police department tells us something, unless our chief tells us something different, if he thinks we need language in there that requires it more often, I don't know that we do.
Yeah.
Ms. Harrison, then Ms. Vincent.
Thank you. My concern would be that this is a fairly new piece of legislation that we're looking at, and it's kind of a somewhat new industry. So one of the things that I would like for us to do is, I think this idea of having Chief give us the information and try that, but can we have a revisit, say in a year or maybe 2 years, and come back and see how this is working, and if we've got fees right or not right, or do we need to change something? That would be my concern.
So have you written that down? Okay, thank you. Let's continue if we can on subject with this, the compliance part. Ms. Vincent?
I agree with Ms. Harrison.
Mr. Abel?
It's probably worth just continuing the discussion when we look at it a little bit harder, but I hate to tie up our public safety assets with a definite second check. We're talking 137 businesses, 2 checks is 274 checks a year, and it might be half an hour physically per check, but there's also travel to and travel back and preparation for the night stings and that sort of thing. So the 70 hours, I think, is a very conservative estimate of how long it might take. And I agree with Councilman Beta that leave it up to the chief.
Mr. Skilling?
I agree with Councilman Beta as well. And I agree with Councilor Harrison that we could just add this to, whether it's in this ordinance or we remember just to have, when the chief gives his report at some point, he can rattle off the stats, what they did, what worked, what didn't work. We can make the adjustment then. If you need discretionary language in this ordinance, I guess if we need to add something like that, I'm not sure we really do. But I would agree with both of them.
I echo that. Ms. Gutwein?
Well, I guess it would appear that there's consensus then, but for the record, I just wanted to say I agree with Councilor Franks, and I think that adding in the 25%, getting the second check, would be a nice compromise. The reason why I'm bringing this up again is that we actually do have the benefit of knowing how other cities have handled this, and that the second check does actually make a difference in making this ordinance stronger and more effective. So I think that we can borrow from our neighbors and their experience and see that this would actually make it a stronger and better ordinance. But so I guess if you're going to raise the question again, or but just wanted to say that.
Yep. Ms. Johnson?
Thank you. I agree with Councilor Harrison. I like the idea of a pilot on this. And also, after listening to all of you, my fussing about the language under the compliance monitoring that they should be conducted as the department deems appropriate is probably appropriate. So I agree with him. All righty.
So it looks like there's consensus at this point. We'll leave the language that was proposed in, and we'll move forward. Require violations to pay for reinspection fees. I got consensus. Sorry, Councilor Beta, but I see you thinking there, and then I had consensus, so I'm just going to move it forward. Mr. Cox, you're good on that. Okay. Ms. Harrison's is to have at revisit after 1 year, looking at fees, number of violations, stores within 500 feet, cost of operations, and checks. So you want 1 year or 2 years? I would suggest 2 years because. Okay. So, Ms. Franks.
I think it would be 1 year a data point, just a data check, and a 2-year review of it. So that way, by the time we get to the second one, we've got 2 years worth of data to then make any policy decisions. So I'd like year 1 for Chief McCaskey to know that we need the data on year 1 of the program, and then year 2 would be the review cycle. Is that acceptable?
Council cool with that?
Mr. Mayor,
Yes.
just going back to what Councilor Skilling said on this topic, which I think maybe spares a few lines on the page to make it so that it's just simply directed to the chief include this topic in his annual report to the council, rather than having the ordinance include a 1 year or 2 year or whatever period it is. That could simply be a matter of direction to the chief, I would think.
So
But
that
it's up to the council.
Yeah, so that's changed a little bit. The latter proposed by Mr. Cox to have that included. Is that
Well,
acceptable?
and I think it requires no amendment. It can simply be directed to the police chief that when you do your annual report, include this information.
Sorry, what I want to see is that this data included in one identifiable source, so that we could see all of the underage 18 tobacco licensing, like what we're looking at tonight, could be shown in one chunk of information.
And I think that's fine, whatever form it's going to take. I think it's probably unnecessary to have the ordinance say there shall be an annual review when the chief does an annual review or report anyway, and you simply can direct him to include that information in his report and then not have to make an amendment to the ordinance.
Well,
But there
we'd
other
have to make
approaches,
that request to the city manager to direct him to include that in his report. So if you want it codified, that would be the policy part. If you want it something from the city manager's office, then that would have to be agreeable to Mr. Goldstein. But I think we're mincing it. I mean, certainly an annual review is fine. And I see that there was consensus on the annual review. I have 3 lights on. Is this to talk about the annual review? Okay. Yep, Mr. Skilling, Abel, Beta.
I think that Councilor Harrison was also trying to include whether the fees were set appropriately, whether some other items. So maybe it would be if we added another section, maybe at the end, that says something to the effect that statistics will be kept for the first year and provided to council on a yearly basis. Fees will be reviewed after year 1. So basically what Councilor Harrison said, maybe we could just add that. And that way it's kind of in there, and then everyone's on notice that we need to be tracking these things from the get. And then also a reminder that we can look at the fees, and it keeps everybody, so the clerk's office can come back and say, yeah, these fees were working, they weren't working, whatever it is. So maybe that is probably the cleaner way to do it, but just an idea.
That's fine.
Mr. Abel and Mr. Beta.
I agree with Councilman Skilling. We do need to specify. Otherwise, 12 years hence, we won't be getting an annual report, or we may be reviewing the fees every year. So I think we need to set that into black and white.
And it might be a good data point for the health department as well to provide that shared information. Mr. Beta?
I guess my concern is cluttering up the ordinance with procedural stuff like this, internal stuff. I think that's kind of what our council is, if I'm understanding him, saying is you're kind of cluttering it up, and do we really need that? Do we not have some sort of internal mechanism that we can accomplish what needs to happen here, which I agree does need to happen. I think it's a great idea. But cluttering up the ordinance, I'm not sure I'm in favor.
That's a general point I was trying to make, Councilor. At the same time, Councilor Skilling has kind of boiled it down to one sentence. So if everybody feels better having that language in the ordinance, that's fine too. We don't charge.
We good with that? The Skilling motion? Okay. So, Mr. Cox, I'm just going to refer to Counselor Skilling on the bottom of.
Yes, I'm hoping he wrote down what he read to us.
I didn't, but I'm going to give it back to him, and he's going to rewrite it. And I'm going to give it to you. All right. And these might be similar. Remove discretion, either remove section E and have simple 1, 2, 3. And then Ms. Vincent, you had remove section E, remove 3, and remove 6. Okay, so 1 is 3 and 6 under the discretion, and Ms. Gutwein, you have 1, 2, and 3. Or, you're simplifying the numbering. Go ahead.
I would just like to see staff come back and see if we can tighten this up in some way that still allows for some discretion, given the example that Councilor Vincent brought up, but makes this as fair as possible and consistent as possible. And I think we had kind of extensive conversation about that.
For the record, we're looking at section 120. I had the page turned over. Yeah, 120, paren E.
Yes. So, for example, number 5, if the violation was willful, my understanding is that determining whether someone willfully breaks the rule is kind of a high bar to set. So I'm just looking to make this as fair and concrete and, eliminate loopholes.
I mean, you're correct that proving willful behavior is a challenge because it requires you to get into the thought processes of the person involved, what they knew, what they didn't know, what they intended to do. That's a universal problem in criminal law, certainly. I think these are intended to be, while it says shall consider the following factors, so there may not be very many cases where willfulness is relevant. It may not, you may consider that factor and say, well, it doesn't really apply in these circumstances. I would hope that for a hearing officer who's not a seasoned trial judge, it might be a little much to expect that they make that kind of a determination about willfulness in every case. So I think these are things that should be considered that may or may not apply in every case, and are intended to guide the hearing officer in reaching a decision on the case. In other words, there have to be, these are criteria to distinguish egregious cases from less egregious cases and provide some structure to the analysis rather than just, well, I think the city has proved its case or whatever it might be. But certainly if those things on this list are problematic for the council, we can try to make them a little more definitive.
I guess, yes. So that is what I'm proposing, is that we make it a little bit more definitive. And then, so for example, if you're found to have for example, if you're found to have the non-cigarette tobacco products in front of the counter, and there's a self-serve, that is a violation. So then, there should be a consequence that's spelled out. So then that would be the first offense within a 1-year period. Maybe it's the suspension for 7 days plus education. Or if they sell to a minor, then that is a first offense. So that's what I'm saying, is like the violations can also be pretty black and white. It's black and white if you sell to a minor. So then there should be a consequence of a suspension for 7 days.
If I could for just a moment, I think we could add language that add a criterion here that indicates whether the violation involves sale to a minor or other conditions of the ordinance, or something that segregates the most severe violations from others. That could probably be done. But using your example of the self-serve, if you look at these criteria and kind of go through that analysis as armchair hearing officer, what are the nature and circumstances of the violation? Oh, well, they put they put the display out on the counter. All right, corrective action if any taken. They moved it. They put it back. Okay, prior violation, it was the 5th time this has happened. Likelihood of recurrence, pretty high, because it's already happened multiple times. Whether it was willful, you can infer a lot from it happening over and over again, and previous sanctions imposed. So that's kind of how the analysis works. Whatever the violation is, if it's sale to a minor or the display or something else, you go through that and you can sort of rank the level at which each of these factors apply, and make a determination that that circumstance that I just described is less egregious than what you were just talking about with the sale to a minor.
But then if they have the self-serve and they get violation 2 times, then this would prescribe that the 3rd time it's revoked. So I understand that there's a big difference between having the self-service in front versus sale to a minor. I'm just asking if we can come up with a method that has some less discretion, because even when we're dealing with campaign finance violations, when there's discretion, people feel like it's not carried out in the same way.
Right. I understand what you're saying. And I think if it's this question hasn't been raised, but I'll raise it. If it's council's desire that the suspension and revocation language here, if that's only to apply to sales to a minor, you could have a different penalty structure for other types of violations. They don't all have to be treated the same. Yes, we found there's clearly a violation for the self-serve display that results in an automatic 7-day suspension. You could decide that those terms only apply to sales to a minor or to certain types of violations, or have a more graduated series of penalties. Haven't discussed this with the clerk. I'm not sure how she feels about it, but
Please.
Thank you. I go back to the liquor hearings that I've been involved in, and I believe that you really need to give the public hearing officer a lot of discretion regarding mitigating and aggravating circumstances. If you prescribe everything in here, my best guess is we don't need a hearing officer. The police find a violation, we can charge them a fee. But they have to have an opportunity for due process to go before the hearing officer and plead their case. So I would take issue with that, but that's...
Thank you. Mr. Beta and Ms. Vincent.
I agree with our clerk. She's right on. These things, once you get in there, there's so many different possibilities in terms of the of what has happened. From one extreme to the other. Sometimes it's just a silly little oversight somebody made, and sometimes it's willful and it's been done over and over, like council's suggesting, and everything in between. So I think that's, you hire a good hearing officer that understands how to do these things, and it again, if you find out that it's not working, that people are getting away with too much, and we're not enforcing the rules, then you can come back certainly and tighten them up. But I think what you have here is more than adequate.
And Mr. Mayor, I would point out that in that paragraph we're looking at, there's the language: the actual sanction imposed upon a licensee for any violation may vary from the guidelines when warranted by the specific facts and circumstances of the case. I think that's what Councilor Beta is talking about, is every case is different and you need to have some flexibility. And I would agree with the clerk on that.
Ms. Vincent?
I just would like to withdraw my amendment.
Okay, thank you. And then to Ms. Gutwein's amendment, is there consensus? Yeah, so it's to remove discretion, either remove section E and have simple 1, 2, 3 consequences if. So I don't support that. Yeah.
One final clarification is that, again, this was also based on how the other ordinances in other cities, the 10 other cities that have passed non-cigarette tobacco retail licenses, is that they did have issues with this discretionary language, which is the entire purpose of trying to tighten it up here. But again, there is consensus, so that's
Well,
fine.
we're trying to get consensus, and I guess we're hearing from our city attorney and our clerk who will be tasked with this, that what is in it is sufficient. And so that's where the conversation is now. So there's consensus to move forward with Councilor Gutwein is explaining, or to go forward with essentially the language at this point that's in hard copy. Hard copy? Hard copy. Okay. Amend within 1 year period to 3 year period. Ms. Gutwein?
So, again, this is based on what they've been seeing in other cities, and that if you can expand that 1 year to 3 years, it gives you a better opportunity to see what kind of patterns exist. So again, now that there is discretion, I think that it's safe to expand that period, and just give everyone the opportunity to see, you know, if you're having consistent violations over 3 years, there may be additional need to face consequences.
So to the summary of that is to expand the penalty period from 1 year to 3 years.
Yes.
Is there consensus for that? And if we can't come to consensus, it's certainly something that can be brought to the floor on second reading. Mr. LeBear?
Are we referring to the part on section .120? Is that what we're?
Yes, and it's F1, 2, and 3.
Where's your language that says 1? Could you point that out?
I'm sorry? So section 5.06 120, and it's F 1, 2, and 3. So that is paid. All right.
There we go.
Towards the bottom of that page you're looking at.
So just the amendment would be for a third or subsequent offense within a 3-year window. And again, this is all subject to the discretion now of the hearing officer. So all of the mitigating circumstances would be considered.
Please.
So you're just asking for number 3 to be changed to a 3-year?
That's correct.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, that's it. Number
Under
3
F1,
from
No, under
no,
F
I'm sorry.
and 3.
Yes, for number 3, F3, from a 1-year period to a 3-year period.
Mr. Beta?
Counselor, you've been referring several times this evening to experiences from other cities, and I don't know what you're talking about. Is there some data that I'm not, or is that just your own knowledge, or is there something in the presentation that I'm not picking up on?
So the Jefferson County of Public Health sent all of us these recommendations, and we also got them from a number of citizens, many of whom are here today, and they also partnered to help write the very ordinances that we're looking at with Golden and Edgewater. Since then, they've done continued research, and I apologize for speaking for you because you could do this better than I could, but and so that continued research and the new best practices that continue to develop is why they sent and evaluated our draft ordinance and then sent us those additional amendments. So I don't have extensive in and out knowledge of the data, but I know that we could certainly ask for it and have that shared with us. But I do know that that is considered the best practice to move that from 1 year to 3 years. Does that answer your question?
So might I propose, let's just leave it. And if we want to get more information, again, that's a simple modification that could be made to 5 years, 3 years, 1 year, 6 months on second reading. Is that okay?
Sure.
Is that okay with the council? I'm looking to my left. Okay. So we will leave that. Well, is there support to change it to 3 years? Is there support to change it to 3 years?
No, not for me.
Yeah, there's no
Okay,
consent.
so let's get more information.
Okay, 500 foot, should exemption carry over to new property owner?
Do I need to explain that?
Council, would you like, yeah, why don't you just, yeah.
There's a reference to an exemption for people, current retailers within 500 feet of a school. And my question earlier was, does that exemption transfer to the next property owner? I'd like to ask the attorneys in the room if we can refuse to let that exemption carry over, for one thing. And secondly, I have no real conviction either way. I just think we need to make that clear from the get-go, whether that exemption can transfers when the property transfers.
It's a great question. Can I elaborate on that too? Does it mirror, in that instance, would that mirror our liquor and our marijuana? Well, I guess marijuana we don't accept new. Well, but they still transfer ownership and it's still transferable.
I guess I'm trying to understand it a little bit. You're saying you do not, if they transfer the license to a new owner.
The license, I believe, doesn't transfer. If I own a property that's exempt and I sell it to Jacob, is Jacob exempt from the 500-foot distance, or is he out of luck when it comes to selling these products?
I think that depends on whether, and we had talked about it earlier, whether that is whether the license is transferable or not. If the license is not transferable, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Cox, but if it's not transferable to the new owner, then yes, you could put those, act like it's a new one, and that 500-foot distance requirement would take effect. But if we're transferring the license to a new owner at the same location, the grandfathering would stay in place. Am I making sense?
I thought the license wouldn't transfer. My question has to do with, and if the license transfers, that might be the answer, but it's my impression that any new owner would have, of any establishment, would need to submit a new application to reflect the change in operation. Is that correct?
As written, there's language, fairly clear language that a license is not transferable. But then we did talk earlier in the meeting about if it's the same location, having the system set up so that it actually is there could be a new application process, but the transfer would take place to that. And if that's the case, you would not apply the restriction to the new owner. He or she would be buying the business as it exists.
Right, and and my question is whether we want to do one or the other.
Right, and that, what we just described, would be consistent with what we do with legal nonconforming uses in the zoning context, where it was compliant when opened, but is no longer compliant with the zoning rules. We don't, when it transfers ownership, you don't remove that permission. So it would be consistent, at least in that regard.
I think Mr. Skilling is going to weigh in.
Thank you.
Yep.
That was when we did the first listing. We had license transfers to new owner, and then comma subject to a transfer fee. That's supposed to be read as discussion about transferability of a license, and then, by the way, when that happens, if there's going to be a fee. So it was meant to be almost a two-parter. I think it was read as only, let's have a fee. But what we're really saying is, if you're buying a business or it's transferring, because again, we were linking that to person, the license doesn't run with the person necessarily, it would run with the entity. So if you're an entity or store that has it and you sell that, I sell my store to Charlie and he has an Counselor Abel, and he has a exemption, then it would run with the business. So obviously the new business would have that. So that's what we meant by that motion, was to add language that went the opposite way. Instead of being non-transferable, it would be transferable, but perhaps we have to flush out what that means depending on what the application looks like. So if every owner of the business has to go through an application process similar to whether it's some other licenses that we have, then that may change things. But
Right. And I think
I will never ask another lawyer to clarify something.
but that would be the issue, right? So if you're taking ownership of a business, does that mean then you have to reapply for all the licenses of that business? In alcohol terms, oftentimes you would, if they're doing background checks or whatever they're doing, depending on the license that you're getting.
Right. And what I heard as part of the early discussion was we don't want to allow transfers from one location to another, but the same business at the same location being transferred would be allowed, even if it's subject to a transfer fee to cover the administrative cost of handling that.
And that exemption would then travel to answer Charlie's question, the exemption would travel with the new ownership.
Thank you very much.
That was brief.
We're going to have another lawyer weigh in, Mr. Beta.
Well, my concern would be if you don't allow the exemption to transfer, then you potentially have a taking there, because there can be some real value there with that license and with that exemption. So.
Well said.
So shall we include language to ensure that that is clear?
Do we have consensus on that? I think we do. Okay. Thank you. Let's see here. So we have within 45 days is done. Okay. And then last, unless there's any more, I have an exemption based on 9.38.040 that would exempt tobacco businesses that are already required under our previous rules and regulations and code to not allow anybody under 18 along into their premises to be exempt. Same. So any consensus on that? I see no's. I see no's. Okay. So can I modify that to more information based upon how many we have in operation to get a better understanding? So there's consensus, there's a couple no's, but majority consensus. So that's just a fact-finding mission to find out how many we have in operation. Cool. All right. Sausage making.
Could I just go down the list as I have it and make sure that, no, good.
Of course. Hold on.
I wouldn't want to listen to me either, so.
No, you're fine. But this is really what a study session is for, and I think it'll serve us very well when we come back to look at the potential adoption. So go ahead.
So I have the first one concerning the definition of person. The second amendment would be making it clear that it applies to all sellers. Number 3 is the one we just talked about with the transfer to a new owner and subject to a transfer fee. And I think where we talked about it further down with the 500-foot exemption, that can all be part of one amendment. Number 4 deals with the self-serve displays. Number 5 dealt with the definition and the percentage and eliminating that percentage. Number 6 was for the number of compliance checks per year, and I think we ended up on the current language, didn't we? Yeah. All right. Number 7 is the reinspection fee. It's actually the 6th one now, but it would be the reinspection fee. Next was the
Review.
the annual review. I have something written down ahead of that and can't for the life of me read it, but all right, so the annual review was next, and then the 3-year change was put off for further research. The exemption, the 500-foot exemption, we covered in the earlier concerning transfers, and then the last one we just talked about is also put off until we could do some additional fact finding. So I don't think there were any others besides what we just read. Good.
Nice summary.
Good.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you all very much for all your input and hard work, and encourage you to stay engaged. Moving right along to something that's going to be a lot of fun. I think Councilor Abel's really jazzed. Councilor Skilling's excited too. Mr. Hutchison, good evening.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening.
Bike share and scooters and e-bikes, which Councilor Franks has. She has an e-wheel. Oh.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, City Council. Recognizing that 2 of you are gone, I'm certainly willing to postpone the beginning of this discussion for less than 3 minutes on a football clock, if that's your preference. But assuming you'd rather proceed.
Please proceed, and don't tell us the score.
I will not.
Thank you. No, don't even do that.
Not even a hint.
Censure her.
We're going to talk this evening about something that we're calling dockless mobility. It's not a perfect term, but if I spend a little bit of time introducing the main presentation, perhaps that will help. Simply put, what we're really talking about tonight is bicycles and scooters available for short-term rentals just for the time of the trip, and they're essentially available on demand, and the user gets to pick the end destination. And I'll distinguish that from some other options that are out there in just a couple of minutes. This is a relatively new technology, and yet many components have been around for a long time. We've had scooters and bicycles in the transportation network for decades. There are existing laws on how to operate those kinds of things. We're not going to go into that level of detail tonight. We've had rental vehicles for a long time, taxis, Hertz, commercial trucks, all kinds of leases and rentals. We've had shared motor vehicles for less than a decade, actually. Lyft and Uber have not been around terribly long, but they're well entrenched technologies today. And all of that has led to the current transition in transportation and transportation options and technology, which includes bike share and now scooter share. Share probably isn't quite the word for what we're talking about tonight, but it kind of is an evolution from the docked bikes that were shared that you've seen in Denver called B-Cycle. They're used across the country. They've been around less than about 8 years. And in Denver, they've generally been in the core part of the city, with the exception that there are 8 docks in Lakewood. Perhaps you're not aware of those. They're all in the Federal Center. And because the bicycles have to be taken from a dock and returned to a dock, and the clock keeps ticking on the fee until you get it back to a dock, they rarely leave the Federal Center, of course. The docks are expensive. They have maintenance costs and complexities that are difficult to deal with, and they determine the endpoints of any trip. So there's a transition from that to a dockless technology, which allows for distributed availability based on demand. It also reduces cost, and it allows people to determine where their endpoint is going to be. The shift is evident in a couple of ways that I'll just use as examples. Seattle actually has abandoned its dock-based bicycle system and shifted entirely away from that to dockless systems. And the Federal Center is actually doing somewhat the same thing. They're extracting themselves from B-Cycle. They'll still have the bikes, but there won't be a dock requirement related to that. They'll still end up every night at the Federal Center, however. There is interest in Lakewood by providers of the bicycles and the scooters. We've had them come and go just a little bit so far. They've been very clear that they want to work with us and not just dump a bunch of things in the community. And part of the timing is being driven by the fact that the demand's greater in the denser communities. So in downtown Denver, there's a lot of these kind of facilities, not much in Lakewood yet. There's also interest from the consumer side on using these devices as well for transportation purposes. So tonight we're going to talk about dockless mobility. And today that can mean 3 different kinds of vehicles. And I say today because this is an evolving industry and we may see things differently soon. Who knows? I'm not predicting anything. But there's regular bicycles. There are e-assist or e-bikes which have an electric motor in them that can assist the operator in transporting that vehicle down the road. And then there's electric scooters as well. There's all 3 types of vehicles used on these dockless mobility facilities. There's an evolution underway, not only in the types of equipment that's used, but also in how they're managed. And that's from both the private sector side, the provider side. They're learning more and more about this. They have a lot of interest in making sure they're utilized well. And from the government side, trying to figure out what the best way to make these things work in the right of way that's used for so many other purposes and for which government generally is the steward. So there's a lot of evolution occurring. We have the luxury of not being on the bleeding with a B edge of this evolution. Others have had to deal with a variety of things. There was an article in today's Denver Post about a little issue between a dockless vehicle rider and a pedestrian. Turns out that the law actually is clear on who was correct on that one, but it's not tonight's topic. And tonight we're not actually seeking a policy decision. Tonight's really intended to be an informational session to share what we've learned to date generally about how this is working and identify some of the pros and cons. And our recommendation is that you send us out in the community to gather more input, and then we'll obviously come back to you with an update at some point. So I'm going to bring someone up who knows more about this than I do. Mr. Mike Whitaker is the city transportation engineer, and he'll make the bulk of the presentation this evening.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Whitaker. Welcome.
Mayor and council. So we're talking about dockless mobility. You also might start seeing it referred to a little bit as microtransit. Denver Regional Council of Governments have started to use that name a little bit. On the left, as Jay mentioned, is a traditional bicycle. In the middle is the electric scooters, an example. And on the right is an e-assist bike. This scooter was captured there on Colfax, across from Home Depot. So they are bleeding into our city already. Just give you a little bit idea for those that haven't used them. You basically download an app on a smartphone usually, set the account up, and then you can look on the map on the app, find the device you want to use, go to it, scan a little tag. It'll unlock the lock, and you can take off on your ride. When you're done, you just basically, wherever you're done ending your ride, you just check out on the app, and that trip's done, and the bike's ready for the next person. Scooters are essentially the same way. There's an app, a map. You can ride it. A little bit different, obviously. Not everybody's quite as coordinated as sometimes on a bicycle. But you get used to them pretty quick. There's a little finger brake usually and a little thumb throttle. A lot of times the back fender's also a brake on the back. Your app sometimes will have a battery monitoring, so to show you how much range you still have left, to give you a little idea that you can still go 20 more miles if you wanted to. So we're getting more into the meat of it now, and parking's kind of a hot topic sometimes, makes a lot of headlines. In Colorado, we're allowed to park bicycles and devices on the sidewalk as long as it doesn't affect the normal and reasonable movement of a pedestrian. I'm sure not every citizen out there understands that. So that's kind of the gray area that kind of happened in Denver today too. On-street parking, we're actually allowed to park on the street. Could be at any angle to the curb. Could be multiple bikes. Once again, as long as it doesn't obstruct the normal reasonable movement of a vehicle. RTD's starting to develop the guidelines for these as well. You'll see in the middle upper picture the preferred parking zone where they're having them paint out a parking area to try to co-locate a lot of these devices in the similar area. Bike racks obviously are a good location. Down at the Lamar station, another scooter was captured in Lakewood there. Nice parking job out of the way. Places we don't want them parked, obviously, anything that obstructs traffic or pedestrians, gated private communities where people can't have access to them, inside your residence. They do have a program to charge these electric devices, so some people are allowed to take them into their residence. And then they've also worked, some of the providers have worked with large areas like on the Denver Center, potentially for Lakewood, where they can decide whether they want to allow these devices on there, and they'll create a geofence on the app to tell you you're not supposed to ride in that area, park in that area. And so you can show up and they'll say, hey, you've arrived at, the Denver Federal Center, please park. And so there's a lot of entrepreneurial stuff going on with where they can be, where they can't be, and how to get that information to the riders. As Jay says, in Denver, this was kind of a hot topic yesterday, I guess. Bikes obviously can be on, bike paths and sidewalks, at least in Lakewood. Scooters are a little less clear. Right now they're classified as a toy vehicle. And so Denver has used that to say that they can be on the sidewalks only, even though anybody who's been in Denver has seen lots of them in bike lanes and local streets and that type of stuff. We've been working with an interdepartmental meeting today, and our legal is still trying to investigate that. The initial view is it may not be allowed on any public right-of-way. So that's still up in the air, and we're trying to get more information on that. Parks Department, right now we have a non-motorized restriction. So we're also looking in the parks and park paths, how do we roll this all together to make some sense with the explosion of e-bikes, whether they're rentals or personal. There are challenges. Some people have perceptions of litter. Congested sidewalks, as we talked in Denver, you see a lot going to like the Rockies games and any big event, and do you really want them on the sidewalks when there's tons of pedestrians? When the sidewalk's wide open, it's a great place for them. They can go up and down, but they can go about 15 miles an hour usually. So, there can be different rider abilities that come into the fact too. So there's lots of things to think about. Like with any device you leave out in the public, some people vandalize them and sometimes they break. I just talked about the speed of the devices on the sidewalks. Major hubs like the transit centers, if you think of the Wadsworth RTD station or Lamar, these could collect quite a few of them. You might have 20, 25, who knows. So how we work with where they park and that is somewhat of an issue. Community centers, usually we have pretty big plazas near them, so we think we have enough room at some of those hubs, but it can still be an issue. And poor parking does create a lot of the headlines and drives a lot of the complaints. Denver has had less calls than they expected when they implemented this. And Seattle did a pilot of almost 400 parking investigations, and only about 4% were found to not be parked legally, according to their code. Obviously benefits. We've had 5 scooters dropped off right here at the transit center across the wall. Great for short trips, go to your friends, transit stops, go to school, short little quick trips to the grocery store. Obviously mobility, that they're looking to kind of do that last mile, get people to use transit more, get them to and from destinations. they're trying to get the most usage out of these devices, so they're constantly looking at where they're being used, how many they're getting used, how many trips they're getting on each device, and they can move them around to try to drive more usage, obviously. It's also a mobility option for people who don't have cars or can only pay as they go. A lot of the cities and agencies are grabbing data from the companies as part of their requirements so that we can see where they're being used, where they're going, where they're coming from, and it can help us prioritize what kind of infrastructure we may need on certain corridors or between different nodes, help us make a little more informed decisions. Does meet the goals of the Bicycle Master Plan to provide a little more active mode of transportation. Obviously with the e-assist, it's going to reduce that calories a little bit. Talk about a little bit about how they're different than maybe your personal bikes at home. Similar, if you have an e-bike, it goes about 15 miles an hour. This bike, they're saying, is about 62-mile range on a full charge battery. But you can see they've increased the durable bike stand because that's one of the failure points, anti-theft seat post, airless tires, things that are creating more maintenance problems for them. They're trying to address, and it's a constant evolution. They've got a little basket with a little solar panel to power the GPS and the little cellular data pack in the lock. You're seeing some companies, they transfer really quick. About 5 months ago, when we first started thinking about dockless bikes, it was just dockless bikes. Scooters weren't on the horizon. And it's evolved now where scooters are a lot of the fleet percentages now are more scooters. You can see on the right picture, some companies are actually looking at what we call fat tire mountain bikes, So in the wintertime, maybe that's a better percentage of their fleet to make it more usable than the scooters. They're pretty flexible, and they're trying to drive their business. It is a young, evolving industry. You've heard a lot of headlines probably where they've just dropped off a whole bunch of devices in a city. Now there are more collaboration. We've had a couple companies drop some off in Lakewood, and we've just talked to them and said, we're not quite ready for those. We're still trying to get feedback from council and the public. And so most of the time they voluntarily picked them up within a couple hours. I will say the ones that were dropped off in the one big jump that we know, the 20 to 25 units, I think all but a couple were used before they were able to pick them up. So there's definitely some latent demand out there for them. The companies do a routine rebalancing of the fleet every night, it sounds like. They're constantly looking to move it to needs. Denver has set up what they call opportunity zones, where some companies can get extra devices into their fleet if they put a certain percentage of their fleet in certain areas where they're trying to give more opportunities for some segments of the population to use them. With any company, as you grow bigger, you can probably improve your response time to complaints as the metro area is getting more and more of these, are getting more staff. A lot of the agreements that we've seen, it's usually about a 2-hour response time to a complaint is what's in the agreement. They claim they're more 30 to 45 minutes to actually do it, but they'll agree to a 2-hour in the agreement, but they're usually beating that. Parking, as I've mentioned, has kind of been a headline issue. So some companies are going with what we call the carrot and the stick approach, where if you park in a good location, one of their preferred zones, they might give you $1 off your rental. You have an account, so they track you. And so if you're a repeat offender, they can start charging you a little bit more. And if you take it to the full extent, they can stop letting you rent stuff. One example is like on the 16th Street Mall in Denver. If you park one device there is a $25 surcharge. So it can get pretty heavy. Most of the companies do have programs for low-income people who qualify. And there's also some programs for people who don't have a smartphone, but maybe they have a regular cell phone, where you can text a number in from the bike to their company, and if you have a prepaid account with them, they'll unlock it. So there are some users or ability for non-smartphone users to use the systems. Currently, there's 4 main providers in the Denver area: Bird, Jump, which is now part of Uber, Lime, and Lyft. Spin and Razor are also about ready to unload a bunch of devices in Denver. So we're looking at about 6 companies that are really looking at the Denver area right now. But there are no guarantees. Some of you may know that Golden had a bike share program for about a month and a half. And then the company that was running it just decided they didn't want to serve North American markets anymore, and they pulled out. Aurora had 3 or 4 different vendors there, and they're down to about 1. So it kind of all depends on usage. It's a very fluid business, economic-driven industry right now. So where we're at is we're proposing to do some public education and input, do some public meetings, develop proposed requirements, and then update the city council. We're talking about doing some specific invitations to some of the larger entities, like the business improvement districts, like West Colfax and Alameda, the business associations, Union Quarter Professionals, West Colfax are examples. Large destinations like St. Anthony's, Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design, Jeffco Schools. The retail centers, we think we'll get a lot of it. So we're talking to like the Colorado Mills, the Belmars, the Lamar stations, City Commons. Some of the bigger housing groups, West Metro, 40 West Residences, Alta. Neighborhoods, obviously, Two Creeks, Iber, Belmar, Green Mountain are examples. We'll invite everybody on our neighborhood list. And of course, the last 2 transportation partners, RTD and CDOT, will be involved since their heavy presence in Lakewood. And with that concludes my presentation.
Very well done. Thank you. I appreciate the update. And again, I think it's important to note that this was an update. I think the process that you've laid out makes sense. You know, when we started having conversations with Denver a couple years ago about the bicycle type, we did realize fast how expensive, and the market changes daily almost, right? But we did realize that there needs to be a draw in some instances. And so looking at certain pilot areas seemed to make sense, whether it was 40 West or whether it was Belmar with the city center here in Colorado Christian University. So I think that could be a great opportunity, and especially when we have the ability to potentially do geofencing and things along those lines. But what happens, and I'd say for the art line also, the scooters are incredible for the art line. It really adds to the mobility of it. But what happens if we get in a situation where they're playing nice? They didn't really play nice in Denver. They just came in and dropped whatever they wanted, and Denver was forced to act in a expedited fashion. And I certainly don't want to have to engage in that. And what do we have to safeguard us in our community from that? Because I think that there's a lot of things we want to do, and people you'll hear probably in a minute who have a lot of experience with this in other communities. So how do we safeguard that?
We're researching what legal tools might be actually enforceable in that regard. In the meantime, as Mr. Whitaker mentioned, we've had good cooperation from the providers that have been interested in Lakewood to date, and we'll continue down that path as long as we possibly can. But at the same time, we're looking at the enforcement side in case it's necessary.
Well, and I guess at the end of the day, if we feel it's illegal on right-of-way streets and everything else, then they'll just be taken and confiscated.
That could be the end result.
All right. We have a shopping cart ordinance. Ms. Harrison?
Did you want to wait until after public comment to ask questions, or how do you want to do this?
Ms. Duffy signed up to speak, and she's not here, so.
Okay, so we get to ask questions. Okay. Excellent presentation. I guess I was wondering if, because we've already seen this head for bicycles and scooters, do you think that it's also going to go to other forms of transportation, i.e. like a Segway and a hoverboard or all kinds of things? So, I mean, there's various different kinds of transportation that I could see this idea could apply to. Do you know if it's happening so far?
Yeah, I think scooters are a great example where they weren't on our radar 3 months ago, and so we're trying to be generic enough that it covers most things. We know we've seen some agencies now that recumbent style bicycles are showing up for certain disabilities. But there's also scooters with seats. There's 3-wheeled devices. I think with our climate, obviously in the winter it adds some challenges, but there's also some advantages. But yeah, we're trying to be generic enough that we're not just focused in on what's now.
Thank you. Do you mind? I've got a couple of other things here on my list. Can I just blow through them real quick? And you don't have to answer these. I had questions. Fees based on location or flat rate. That would be one thing to, in your comment, you said that there were areas where they were changing the fees for low income locations or whatnot. So I think that would be important. Is there an age requirement on the use of these scooters or whatnot? Do they need to be licensed, drivers licensed?
So right now, I believe it's by provider, but there are some providers that require their users to be 18 and upload a driver's license to create the account. But it is, I think, provider dependent right now. And as far as the low income, it's usually just a reduction on the fee. So most of these are, a fee to unlock and a fee for a certain amount of time. And so they just give you a reduction on whatever that rate is.
Well, it would be important. Here's where I put my insurance agent hat on for just a moment. It would be important if that's potentially a licensed vehicle, they need to have a driver's license to be able to do that. And especially if we decide to allow them to drive on a part of the street, i.e. the bicycle lane. That's a little scary to have them in a somewhat almost motorized vehicle. I don't know if state law addresses that. I honestly don't know. So that would be a question.
Right now, they're classified as a toy vehicle. The scooters anywhere are classified as a toy vehicle, which means no license required. But it also restricts where you can use them, where we have to work with legal to figure out where we're going to allow them.
And if we suddenly allow them on the street, then that could be a problem. And same with helmet laws. Do helmet laws apply to scooters or?
Colorado, we don't have a helmet law for bikes, motorcycles.
We should have a helmet law. Okay, that was mine. On the parking issue, there are a lot of ADA conflicts. Potentially, I could see where if we don't make sure that the parking of the scooters and bicycles, et cetera, are cleared, where now we have a situation where someone in a wheelchair or other form of mobility challenge can't get through. And that could be a real issue, I think. And you addressed my question about who picks up and redistributes the bicycles or the vehicles. I'll just call them that for the ease of how do they do that? And you said the owners or the team come in and redistribute every night. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So just a reminder, this is just kind of an update that all this stuff is going to go out and be vetted in the community here if council gives that direction. So I have Mr. Beta, Mr. Abel, Ms. Franks, and then Ms. Johnson.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a quick question. It's the lawyer in me. What kind of potential liability are we looking at for the city? I'm thinking of one of these scooters that are motorized at 15 miles an hour. I don't know if you realize how fast that is, but 15 miles an hour is pretty fast, especially if you crash and burn. And no helmet laws. I can see people getting on these things, having limited skills, trying it out, and getting hurt fairly significantly. I've heard of it happening. So I'm just kind of worried about our liability on behalf of our city. I mean, at first blush, it seems like, we're not sponsoring this, but again, if we get involved in it, there could be a connection. So I don't know if that's something we're looking at or have, looking for data on or anything.
It's one of the issues that our deputy city attorney is looking at. He's doing the research on this issue, on these vehicles.
Be a lot of work for the strong arm I forgot my order. I think it was Mr. Abel, then Ms. Franks, and then Ms. Johnson.
I was glad to hear these folks decided not to bargain with us at the end of a cudgel like they did with Denver. Denver has a very complex ordinance, and it would seem that would be very necessary. I'm a little bit concerned about the condition of some of our sidewalks. If you take off on a scooter down the sidewalk on the south side of Colfax and you're all of a sudden at Burger King, you're liable to be eating your teeth. That would play into the liability question as well. If our sidewalks are not in shape for these things to be ridden on, and we allow them to be rented and don't set certain parameters for where you can go and where you can't go, that might be difficult for us. Also, Denver has, I believe they don't allow them in parks and on park trails. On trails I can understand, but it might be fun for everybody but the geese to be riding them around the sidewalks in city parks. So I think that's something we might consider allowing. And the mayor has challenged me to a contest of speed on one of these things. Would that be legal?
Maybe, but a bad idea nevertheless.
The mayor's full of them. Thank you.
I'll just be Ms. Franks.
All right. Well, first point is I make no apologies about my e-bike, of which I have a spare battery, just to make sure that I'm not going to have to pedal any more than I have to. I did want to make sure, and this is more for the community, that some of the e-bikes, they can go up to 20 miles per hour. So I know that's the top speed on mine. So I think that as a community, we need to be cognizant of the fact that we have sidewalks, we have the trails, we have the multi-use paths, and we're going to have people moving on those at greatly different speeds. So that conflict point, I want us to be really cognizant of that. Our sidewalks, many of them, even if they're relatively new, they still will launch you a little bit if you've got to be up on one of those if you're going at a good enough clip. So that's going to be my concern, is how do we respect the facts that we've got walkers, some who, people who are out walking who are using some type of an assist, a walker, a cane, etc. We've got mothers with and fathers with strollers. We've got bikes, we've got e-bikes that can get some pretty good speed. We've got all these forms that are using them, and some of them aren't as wide as others, so then we're going to have conflict points. So I just want us to be really cognizant of all of that. And really, it's everything from rollerbladers. I mean, there's so many forms, skateboarding, that I think that we're starting to see that these additional uses are going to challenge our paths in ways that we might not have thought about. So I think we just do need to step back and see how we're going to factor all of that in. The other thing is I want to talk through and just throw it out there for the community. When it comes to enforcement, if you think about how challenging it is for us now to deal with off-leash dogs, and maybe dogs that are, leaving behind material as they're being walked around, we have a hard enough time enforcing that. So we're adding another layer to code enforce. Somebody's got to enforce this. So I just want to be cognizant of that I think we're already struggling as we grow and maybe don't have the resources with all of the various types of enforcement that folks are looking for in order to feel safe without being overly burdensome. So there's a balance somewhere in there. I don't know where it's at, but I really want the community to engage, because we have parts of the city that are more level and flatter, where that's a different experience. We have Green Mountain, where you're taking a tumble there, it's going to be a different experience. And so we just have to be cognizant that we have very different conditions, but enforcement and conflict zones are a big concern for me.
Thank you. Ms. Johnson?
Councillor Franks, you say everything so nicely. Thank you. I'm not familiar with what happened over the weekend in Denver, But I do have a question. What happens when these scooters, and I've seen a lot of them downtown Denver on the sidewalks, what happens when they hit a pedestrian? And they take off afterwards? What's going on with that? Or is there any kind of data? How much collisions or?
Thank you for the question. The questions, actually, these are all very helpful. This will be a real helpful information as we try to prepare something to come back to you with, and as we talk to the community. I don't know what the answer is. There's probably a repercussion for the one who caused the accident, but that could have been the pedestrian, could have been the scooter, could have been a bicycle. And we have all these conflicts today. As you may remember some of the discussions about the Bear Creek Trail. We have pedestrians, we have strollers, we have bicyclists, we have rollerbladers. So these aren't necessarily new problems. This adds another source for one of the types of, or a couple of the types of vehicles that are involved in those things. So we'll certainly discuss and work through all of these kind of questions. And again, I appreciate the ones you've shared so far and look forward to the others that you have, but I don't have any more answer to that one than I've shared.
Mr. Roybal, Mr. Skilling, Ms. Gutwein,
Thank
Mr.
you,
LeBaire.
Mayor. Jay, just a couple quick questions for you. Accommodations. Thinking private, public accommodations through the streets, sidewalks. Unintended consequences if we have those scooters, we have those bicycles, and we leave it open so they can either go down the sidewalk or go down the street without helmets, obviously, then the impression is going to be for the young kids that are going to elementary schools to say, hey, I can do this too. And I've seen a few in my neighborhood that, they don't have driver's license and they don't know what stop signs are, and they just keep moving on. So kind of maybe a suggestion is to some type of program to educate the community, possibly, and to kind of, so we won't, unfortunately go through some of these heartaches.
Thank you. And you may recall that that's one of the emphases in the recently adopted by the City Council Bicycle Master Plan is education. And it is absolutely legal to take a bicycle on the street, and I suspect that isn't dependent upon your age. So even today we have that circumstance. This is another situation where it may make it a little more common, although I don't see children riding these vehicles very much because there is a cost involved, but we'll certainly look at that question as well. Thank you.
Okay, and also, again, kind of emphasizing, I hear from my other counselors, obviously public space accommodations, and then have they reached out to the private industry or the private market to see if they can possibly store some of their product on their properties?
Yes, they have. As an example, the University of Denver has an agreement with an entity that actually that serves the university. And while there are public streets that go through that university, a lot of that ground is not public in the sense that we think about public rights of way. The Federal Center is an isolated area. It's clearly publicly owned, but it might be a comparable example. In Lakewood, we don't have campuses of that size that are individually privately owned for the most part. So it won't be quite as applicable, but there will be areas, and using the colleges, the three that are in Lakewood, those may be instances where they want to make well known to users and the providers of these vehicles that there are limitations on how they can be used at those facilities. They may provide or require certain kind of parking. They may restrict them from being used in a heavily used pedestrian area. I don't know what their intent might be, but that's one of the reasons that the long narrative of entities that we want to talk to that Mr. Whitaker shared is on our list, as we want to pursue some of those kinds of questions.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Skilling.
So tonight's not a study session, so I won't bore you with all of my opinions. But if you're looking to go out into the world and kind of have some roadmaps, I frequent communities that have these, and they have all of the bad issues and the good issues that come with it. And so I think when you're out with the community, I think to Mayor Paul's point when he started this conversation, the certain zones, we mentioned the Arts District, there's certain places in the city where we're actually looking to decrease traffic, increase walkability, which is what all the property owners want, the drivers want, everybody wants that. And so if you look at it from a zone basis, or parts of some cities I know have been playing with that, where some places it's allowed, some places it's not, and it's actually an amenity to that destination point in the city. So come to Belmar, you can scooter around, but you're not taking that scooter and heading down Alameda, or you're not doing that. You're staying within a certain zone, similar to what you said with the Federal Center, because they stay at the Federal Center. The big consternation that I've seen in those communities, and I think it's all related to that zone concept, is people wake up and they go outside, and actually in front of their house to the sidewalk, and there's 3 or 4 line bikes sitting there, and they've got to move them. And some people have to move them often. And it depends on where you live. Certain residential neighborhoods that abut to busier places with tourists or whatever, they bear the brunt of it. Or you have similar where maybe scooters aren't appropriate in more of a downtown setting where people are, it's just, you have people who aren't familiar with a downtown area and they're zipping around on the sidewalk, or in Denver, and Councilor Johnson, I think that was the issue. There was a scooter on a sidewalk, at least this is what Denver Post said, scooter on a sidewalk, and another citizen took offense to that and said, you can't have scooters on here, and the guy said, yes, I can, and then he whacked him upside the head or something. So the extreme of that is you've got scooters that are just ripping around these downtown corridors, and there's cars and there's everything else, and people don't know where they're going, and it's just madness. Whereas to Mayor Paul's point, 40 West, you're on the little green line, it's certainly less of an issue. And lastly, I would say another consternation that a lot of people have is the safety issue. But I mean, that goes to the age-old, I don't really care if you're wearing a helmet, except that if I hit you and you're not wearing a helmet, now that's kind of the problem. And something that you could do if you did it on a zone basis, so if you do it in a Belmar, I don't know if they've explored this, but having almost a station where you could rent a helmet if it's right there, we could require them, just make helmets available. Currently, my understanding, and I'm no expert on this, companies do make helmets available. It's part of their service. You can request it as part when you sign up on the app, and they'll mail you one or something. But I mean, that's not realistic, because what you have is somebody visiting Belmar, they want to get around, they want to jump on a scooter. Well, there's no helmet there. So it's different than if it's my bike or my motorcycle, because that's in my house, right? But if I'm just out and about, there's no option for helmets. So that would be interesting to see if that's even a doable option. I think in a zone base, you might be able to do that. Just require having instead of propane tanks, where it flips open the cage, you could have a little cage full of helmets. I mean, that would make a big difference, because that's the problem. You're going to have, everyone knows, these scooters that go this fast, you're going to have stuff happen. You wouldn't blame that on this technology. I think to what we're talking about with the zones, I think it's a kind of a win-win for everybody, from a sustainability factor, for everybody. But it's not win-win if you start having them in neighborhoods or in places where they shouldn't be. And if you don't address the safety issue, I think you'll keep hearing safety. So those would be my ideas to kind of test in the community what they think about kind of a zone base.
Ms. Gutwein, Mr. LeBear.
I think that's a really interesting idea. And what I would add maybe is that, to me, one of the big purposes, I guess, of this new and emerging technology is the last mile connection, which you talked about. And so I feel like if we were going to have a zone, then maybe it would have to also zone and corridor. So if you were going to say take the light rail and then hop on your scooter or your e-bike and then go to Belmar, that way you still get that completing the last mile otherwise, you know, you still get off the light rail and then you have no way of getting to Belmar. So I think that that's definitely a great idea, and then maybe we can just examine or ask the community what kind of the key those key last mile connections are. I'm sure that we probably already know what the big ones are. And then also, I really appreciate that this is that we're looking ahead of this before it is a significant problem in our community. So thank you for that. And I agree. I think that from conversations at our ward meetings and stuff like that, I think that one of the biggest concerns that we're going to hear is how pedestrians and bikers are going to coexist on multi-use paths with motorized e-bikes. And finally, I would also like to be involved in this race.
The buy-in's pretty steep.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. LeBear.
I also want to be in the race. But I'm really excited about some of the benefits of using additional shared technology. I'm a frequent user of car share currently. I think there's a lot of benefits. Obviously, I think potentially this is a lower cost option than a car share. I think this could help get cars off the road, obviously, and help reduce congestion in some instances. And I think it also helps that last mile issue. So I think there's obviously some of the key benefits. And then as also expressed, there's a lot of concerns, public safety, enforcement, and infrastructure. So for me, and I think about sort of my own neighborhood, for example, if I wanted to go to my car share, currently I drive to my car share, which sounds kind of weird, but that's because there's also not really a sidewalk to get there and I don't want to walk down the road. So, and I do that because there's added benefits. For example, of taking a car share, especially when you're going downtown, you don't have to pay for parking. You can park at a meter. So there's obviously some sort of built-in benefit. But I guess what I'm saying is the burdens seem to be pretty heavily on the city and the community. So I think this probably opens up the door to talk about how the business can help facilitate some of the benefits, or help share some of the benefits in addition. So I think this might open up the question of a licensing conversation again, in a way of us also benefiting from expressing that. Well, or sharing some of the costs with the business. Excuse me. Thank you. So that's something I would want us to consider.
Thank you. We have a couple more lights. I had a quick question. What's the time frame? And I know I see Mr. Quinn here. I know Alameda Gateway has actually spent a lot of time and was ready to go with a potential pilot program, and that was all pulled back, and it was going to be isolated to the Belmar area. What is the time frame?
We'd like to move pretty quickly with community discussion. There's no reason that can't happen in the next couple of months, and try to get back to you. Given your meeting schedule that time of year, it might actually be after the first of the year, but in the not distant future.
Okay. Mr. Abel, then Ms. Johnson.
Along my street, there are occasionally scooters that are gasoline powered, and you see kids riding along, keeping an eye out for whether the police are in the neighborhood. A lot of folks on Segways. So how do we, or can we say, you can use these electric dockless scooters that are provided by a company, but you can't use your motor powered scooter and you can't use your Segway. And if we zone these things, can we tell folks in my neighborhood, well, you can't use them here, but they can use them over there? So how does this figure in with private gadgets?
That's a good question, and I think one of the things that we're trying to focus on, and again, Greg has been doing the research for us, and will continue to do that. But I've been talking with him a little bit about it, and it seems to us that impact is really how you try to approach these things. Does an electric scooter have any different impact than a gas scooter? You know, as you're saying, if they travel at the same speed and they're the same structure and the same safety concerns, then they're going to be treated the same way. And as has been said, most of these devices have been around in one form or another. It's what's new is in the presentation the share part and then the dockless part. We had started out with sharing. No one ever thought about that. Now we're having bikes that anybody can use, but they were confined to their little docks around the city. And all of a sudden, now we have dockless devices so that they're left lying on the sidewalk or leaning against a fence or what have you. So we're really trying to look at what changes with this advent of new ways of getting the vehicles out there, and the fact that by having them part of a share program, that means they're more numerous, right? I mean, we didn't see so many when you were just looking at the ones that were privately owned. So it's really difficult to try to draw lines between the devices or between the ownership and the sharing. Because at the end of the day, they're all individual, have their own impact based on the speed, the top speed, the stability of them, all of those things. So we're working on it, and we're going to work with Jay's people going forward. But that's one of the key questions: is how do you decide what gets regulated and what doesn't? So. Sorry, I don't have answers for you, but that's what we're looking at.
That's fine, and I'd also like to say that Mr. Whitaker gave us a very thorough and fairly brief presentation. I appreciate brief, and can we borrow him for other presentations, Jay?
I'm hoping he'll do all of mine.
Thank you.
All right, Ms. Johnson, you'll close us out.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate that we're being proactive on this one. Thank you. Actually, in downtown Denver, it is dangerous to walk on the sidewalk. I go down there every once in a while, and they're all over the place. They are scary. And Councilor Skilling, I think you made a case to have pedestrian helmets as well.
Well said. Okay, so with that, is our consensus to move forth with all right.
If I could just add a couple of other thoughts that the community can have in mind too. There is a business side to this, and utilization's critical to the business model. So having these where people want to use them makes them work. Not allowing that doesn't make them work. Doesn't mean we should allow them wherever the business wants them, but it's certainly going to be a factor on achieving some of the potential benefits, is considering those kinds of things. The other thing that I think we can have some confidence about is that we do not really have a circumstance like downtown Denver or the 16th Street Mall. We just don't have those kind of pedestrian densities almost anywhere, with the exception of the Festival Italiano, which should be looked at a little differently, I'm sure, and a few other events. But this going into the suburbs is even newer than the fact that these things are only months old. So we'll be plowing some new ground here, and I think the providers recognize that as well. So we'll try to figure out where the right balance is and come back to you with some recommendations.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Much appreciated. All right, let's go to reports. I'll start all the way at my left. Mr. LeBeer.
Sure, I'll be happy to start. We are having a evening meeting this month. It's going to be on, I'm trying to remember what month it is, October 23rd, 40 West. It's going to be 6 to 7:30 p.m. So I just want to mention that. I also wanted to mention to this council that obviously we have a lot of things that are on ballot in November that are coming up, and something I'm really passionate about is making sure that we're supporting our Jefferson County schools. And so obviously they have some ballot initiatives this year, 5A and 5B, and I was hoping to see if this council had an appetite to see about if we can support those ballot initiatives before the election this November. So I wanted to see if there might be some sort of consensus to move that forward, or if we can have a discussion on that. So just thought I'd share that. And that's my report. Thanks.
Mr. Abel?
I had a very entertaining morning last week. I went to the Lakewood area, Lakewood High School area elementary track meet. And boy, you talk about some athletes with a lot of heart. Those kids got out there and they did their dead level best. They left it all on the track, and it was a pleasure to watch. I won't go into who finished first, second, third, or fourth, because they were all first as far as I'm concerned. The Ward 1 meeting will be Saturday at 920 South Kipling, Good Shepherd Church. We're going to have an election forum, although not everyone in every race has agreed to show up. I think we'll have a good overview of where folks stand, and we'll have a quick rundown of the ballot issues. I'll say quick. With so many ballot issues, there's no such thing as quick this year. But anyway, so we're looking forward to seeing everybody Saturday morning.
Ms. Harrison?
First of all, I wanted to say thank you to all of those that came out to make the Action Center beautiful junk sale very, very, very successful. Thank you. We rejunked everything, and we all have lots more stuff in our garages now. So it was very successful, and I want to say thank you to all those who attended. And I'm going to let Dana tell you about our Ward 5 meeting coming up this Saturday.
Mr. Skilling? Ms. Gutwein?
We are also having a discussion about the many issues on our ballots in Lakewood this year, with some pro-con discussions so that it's fair and balanced, with people speaking pro and con on Tabor, pro and con on 5A, 5B, and I believe we have speakers for the statewide transportation issues as well. So really want to encourage everyone to get informed, and then also to fill in your entire ballot, start from the bottom, work your way up. And of course, this will shock no one, but I also support 5A, 5B, and would love to have the opportunity to discuss that as a body. The reason why is it does impact all of our Lakewood schools. And I think that would be a really important discussion. I don't know procedurally how we can do that at this point. If we can get an item on the agenda in time before the election, but I would certainly think that it's important for us to discuss that option. Thank you.
Certainly. So there is a process. It's not much. It's the same process that any council member would fill out for a council request. So that process is the way that it works. Ms. Johnson?
Thank you. I appreciate you weighing in on the ballot issues. I have to be honest with you, I would not support this council ever taking a stand on a ballot issue. They all have merit on both sides. And I think we would cause ourselves a lot of problem and headaches down the road. So I would prefer us not to weigh in on anything. There's others that I support, and personally that's my own preference. I don't expect the council to adhere to those either.
Ms. Vincent?
In addition to the evening meeting on the 23rd, we do have our regularly scheduled Ward 2 meeting in the morning on the second Wednesday.
Mr. Beta?
Thank you. I agree with Councilor Johnson. I don't think it's appropriate for us to weigh in on the issues of other, the school district or anybody else. We got plenty enough to deal with on our own plate. I think we ought to stick with what we have. Other than that, no report.
Franks? Mr. Royball?
Thank you, Mayor. Just wanted to reach out and say to all our veterans, thank you for coming. We had a very successful Veterans Fair last week. So again, thank you for coming and participating. That's it.
Yeah, I want to thank all of our staff. We had some wonderful participation. Scott Hefty and Corey and Margie, you were there working the door, and a lot of police came, so it was a great experience. Have a wonderful gentleman who's a World War II veteran, still works out every day at Carmody, 94 years old. He popped in, and a lot of council members, and also met a gentleman who was instrumental in providing the Vietnam Memorial in Brighton. And so he has done some research already about those killed in action from the city of Lakewood, and he sent that and has offered himself as a resource to the ACIC as they're looking at their memorial opportunities. So that was really nice. It is now October, which means you can match dollars that the council allocated to the Action Center up to $17,000 through this month. So we can turn that with community support into $34,000. So I've reached out to the Action Center and asked them if they have anything on social media. If they do, I'll make sure that we get that connected, or an opportunity for council to weigh in on their personal lists to make sure that we can try to do that. Went to a really cool groundbreaking today, something that's brand new to the city of Lakewood. It's called the Village Cooperative, and it's a senior co-op. So 62 years and older, and it's actually a true cooperative where folks do own. They buy a share, and they have that opportunity to own a home that is deed restricted. And what's really cool is a lot of the folks are from Lakewood, and they've been waiting for a couple years. The site is just west of Wadsworth on Jewel, kind of behind McGill's Ice Cream. And it's a really cool model out of the Midwest. And I think what I heard from these folks is what we talk about when you're aging in place and you want to step out of your single family home, but you want to buy something. You still want to have an opportunity to own. And that's what these people have in this cooperative. So really excited to see that take off. And we have apples up here, which means Cider Days is this weekend, which is always a great time. Come on out on Saturday and Sunday and do all kinds of things that people do at Cider Days. 40 West had Riot Fest last Saturday night. A great turnout again. Their pop-up cocktail party. Always something fun. And then I had the opportunity, Lonnie Hands-On, who's a really famous artist who lives within the district, was the producer, and yesterday was the last day. It was called Broken Bone Bathtub, and it was a production that actually took place where the one actress was in a bathtub, and there was like 12 to 14 people, and it was very interactive, but it's gone all over the country, and it was here in Lakewood, Colorado. So hats off to everybody in 40 West for continuing just to do incredibly wonderful things. Ms. Greer, anything? Mr. Cox, welcome back. Anything? Okay. Mr. Goldstein, nice job. All right. Thank you for keeping us safe, and we will adjourn at 10:03.